Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku had a second beginning part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story Nutty Nanners from AO3. So let's start the video. Part 1. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 sat in an empty class near the front of the vacant classroom, save his homeroom teacher, 𝗧𝗵𝗲. The dark-haired man seemed all the more intimidating now that he was sporting an eye patch. The intimidation factor of the quirk erasing hero would never fail to impress the green-haired boy. Even with his quirk barely functioning thanks to the loss of one of his eyes, he was still formidable. Or at least, that was what Deku would always believe. Deku shifted awkwardly in his chair, acutely aware of the silence that permeated every corner of the empty room. Aizawa eyed him with a curious and calculating gaze. "About your question," the one-eyed man said, popping the bubble of silence. "Right?" Izuku said with a head nod, his cheeks starting to burn with embarrassment. I decided that I need to discuss other alternatives to just hero work, for obvious reasons." His voice trailed off and he lowered his eyes. "Because by the time I graduate, maybe even before, I'm not going to have a quirk anymore. I'll be quirkless, ineffectual as a hero." When they'd been dismissed for lunch just a short while earlier, Deku had lingered and asked if he could speak privately with Aizawa. The knowledge that he'd soon be without even the embers of OFA was a near constant weight on his shoulders, a heavy pressure in the back of his mind. He still wanted to be a hero more than anything, but the reality of being a hero without a quirk wasn't really a viable one. However, there was another facet of his hesitation to move forward with becoming a hero, one that he hadn't really discussed with anyone. Aside from, in a roundabout way, Uraraka, when she'd been repressing her grief over Himiko Toga's death, the death of Tamura Shigaraki. That loss weighed heavily on his soul and likely always would. Could he call himself a hero or walk that honored path knowing that he'd been unable to fully save that tragic character? He wasn't sure that he could or should. "Are you suggesting that you don't belong in the hero course?" Aizawa asked, drawing the anxious boy from his tumultuous inner thoughts. Looking up and shaking his head, Deku said, "No, I'm not really saying that. I'm just looking to see if remaining in the hero course is the best course of action, considering that I'm going to be quirkless sometime soon." The words hurt to say, but he did his best to swallow down that pain. Losing OFA had been the only option forward, and while it was painful to part with and accept that he would be quirkless again, it was what had to be done. He could accept being quirkless. He would. You don't know when the last embers of One for All will fade though, and while in school you have near unlimited access to the support course's creations. That can largely supplement you so that you only need to use a small percentage of power, which I imagine will allow you to preserve the embers longer than, say, All Might was able to, Aizawa suggested in a neutral tone. "I hadn't really thought of the support course," Deku said with a nod as he thought about 𝗵𝗃 and her sharp mind and useful inventions. Utilizing the tools that she'd created and other students from the support courses would most likely allow him to stay in the hero course, though the loss of OFA was still inevitable. "I think considering your contributions to the war, your public image, and your dedication to helping others makes you an excellent match for the hero course. That being said, I understand the uniqueness of your position and the future that you face and the limitations that places on you." Aizawa paused briefly, his solitary eye narrowing slightly. "There are other ways to be a hero that aren't the traditional route. Being a pro is an excellent goal to strive for, but at the end of the day, a pro hero is only one facet of being a hero. Considering what I know of your character Midoriya, I'd say at your core your greatest longing is to help and uplift others by whatever means are available to you, and if you lack the means, then you improvise. Not everyone can do that, just like not everyone is cut out to be a pro solo hero." Deku tilted his head to the side, looking in confusion at his teacher. Hadn't the man just told him that he should remain in the hero course? Why was he now telling him that not everyone was cut out to be a hero? What non-traditional roles was he referring to? But then it dawned on him. He was talking about paths of heroism that were not immediately seen as heroic. He was talking about things like being a doctor, a teacher, a counselor, a police officer, etc. Professions that didn't necessarily require a powerful quirk or need a quirk at all, but were heroic in their own right by the service that they provided. So, like you, a teacher or something like that? Izuku questioned. That is a good example, yes. When I graduated UA, going solo was an option for me, but my quirk was better suited for teaching purposes, or at least, that's what I believed. Erasure is a highly effective tool for villains, but ultimately with my attack style, I would have made a better silent assassin than solo pro, which wasn't something I wanted to utilize my power for. So, I learned to teach and utilized my quirk for that very purpose while also doing a limited amount of solo or partner hero work on the side. I'm not saying that that would work for you, but given your altruism, I think a traditional profession would be something worth investigating, the dark-haired man explained. But you don't think I need to drop out of the hero course? Aizawa gave a small smile before shaking his head. No, I think you should stay with the hero course while maintaining your already excellent academics so that you can attend university and potentially broaden your horizons that way. Going to a university would be interesting at the least. I'd learn a lot, and I do like learning. Being something like Mr. Aizawa mentioned, a non-traditional hero might be a good idea, Deku thought to himself as Tamura's fading face flashed into his mind's eye. He recalled the haunted eyes of that little boy that he desperately tried to save, the decay he withstood just so that he could hold on to that tender, fragile little soul. The scar that marred his heart from that loss was woven into his very soul. If only I could have been there for you sooner. If only I could have been there for you then. If only. I think that doing something like being a teacher might not be a bad idea. I'll think about it, Deku said with a gentle head nod. Aizawa gave a heavy sigh before leaning back in his chair. Do that. Now, go join your friends for lunch. I'm sure they're missing you. Sure thing, Deku agreed as he stood up and gave a small bow of gratitude to his teacher. Thank you for talking with me and your honest thoughts. Anytime, Midoriya, Aizawa said with a wave of his hand before dropping his one-eyed gaze down to a stack of papers on his desk. Deku walked out of the classroom and began heading in the direction of the cafeteria. He had a lot to think about. Ochako Uraraka sat next to 𝗬𝗎𝗎𝗎 in the cafeteria, a plate of piping hot curry in front of her. She'd slowly been working her appetite back up over the last few weeks. After Himiko Toga's sacrifice and subsequent death, she'd become depressed and had lost any appetite that she had. Ochako had found herself skipping meals more often than not, and when she'd been hungry enough to eat, the food tasted like ash. Thanks to Deku confronting her, things had gotten significantly better. He'd been exactly right about what he'd said about her, and deep down, she knew that repressing 𝗵𝘃𝗍 feelings like anguish and sorrow while putting on a guise of happiness were eating away at her heart. But as usual, the green-haired boy had managed to peer into her soul and had seen the hurt there and bravely attempted to soothe it. That hurt was still a part of her, just like Himiko was a part of her thanks to her noble sacrifice to save her with her own life's BLD, but the anguish and despair she'd felt had been released. She'd been seen and heard and was able to effectively mourn after that. You're my hero, Deku's words echoed in her mind as she filled her spoon with curry. I'm his hero, she thought to herself with a little smile. That's enough, it's all I need. Wouldn't you like more? The question entered her mind seemingly out of nowhere and felt alien, as if it weren't something that she'd thought of herself. Ochako blinked in confusion, the thought making her stop midway to spooning the curry into her mouth. Where had that question come from? Being his friend and knowing that she was so lofty in his eyes that he considered her his hero was more than enough. Movement in the cafeteria caught her eyes as she realized that the boy she'd just been thinking about had entered the room. Brown eyes locked onto the short boy and followed him until he sat down next to Todoroki and Ida. She took in his expression and thought it looked a little forlorn. Why you sad? Ochako? Tsuyu's voice interrupted her staring and confusing thoughts. Ribbit? You're about to drip curry onto your blazer. Oh! Ochako exclaimed and hurriedly shoveled the curry into her mouth. She felt her cheeks growing warm from embarrassment for being openly caught having a scatterbrained moment. Are you okay? Tsu asked, her gaze probing. Uraraka refrained an urge to shift uncomfortably. Just like Deku, 𝗵𝘃𝗍 saw too much and seemed far too intuitive to Ochako's inner thoughts. I'm fine, I was just, I was thinking about sad things, she admitted in a quiet voice, her eyes lowering. "Do you want to talk about it?" 𝗵𝘃𝗲 asked, a gentle hand on the auburn shoulder. Ochako gave a reassuring smile and shook her head. "No, it's okay, I promise." Her eyes wandered back in the direction of Deku. Tsu followed her gaze before giving her a long look. "You could talk to him if you want," Tsu suggested. Ochako's gaze whirled back to her friend, her eyes widening. "What? I don't need to talk about anything, really. And I was just looking in that direction and he happened to be there." She could feel her cheeks start to heat up in embarrassment. "Ugh." Tsu started, but a high-pitched giggle interrupted her. "Down bad, Ochako?" Mina Ishido, who sat across from the two girls, said with suggestively raised eyebrows. Excuse me. I'm not. What are you even talking about?" Ochako asked in an overly dramatic tone that convinced no one. "Sure," Ishido said with a mischievous twinkle in her eyes. "Nobody would think less of you for it. You should go for it. You two are like besties, more than besties. If anyone should be an item, it should be you two." "Still don't know what you're talking about," Uraraka lied, her eyes on her curry as she hurriedly filled the spoon up and shoved it into her mouth. "Just shut up, Mina," she thought to herself in annoyance. "I was just looking at him, nothing more. There's nothing more going on. He comforted me when I was sad and told me I was his hero. That's it. That's all it needs to be. I am satisfied with this. We both have too much going on anyway. I can carry these feelings, this love by myself and keep it locked away because it coming out would just complicate things. This is enough for me. Is it?" The question again echoed in her head, continuing to feel alien. Was this her subconscious speaking to her? Speaking from some deep-down longing and want that there was more that she wanted but refused to acknowledge? Was this Freud's ID speaking? Himiko Toga's smiling face from that day entered her mind. She vividly recalled that tender smile the blonde had given her, a solitary tear rolling down her cheek, her face half her own and half Ochako's. Ochako's stomach twisted as sorrow touched her heart, sorrow that was laced with confusion. "Why am I thinking about you now? Why are you popping into my head now? What are you trying to tell me? What?" But there were no answers, only memories of a blonde girl who willingly gave up her life so that Ochako could live. It was a decision that Uraraka would never fully understand and wasn't something she was ever going to be entirely accepting of. Himiko Toga shouldn't have had to die. Without intending to, her gaze drifted back in the direction of Izuku Midoriya, who was smiling now. Todoroki was talking to him and also appeared to be smiling. Just looking at him made her heart feel a little lighter. This is enough, but is it? This time the thought was most definitely her own. "I don't know." Deku walked along the path from the UA campus and back toward the dormitories, Uraraka and Azui at his side. Todoroki was a short way ahead of them, Ida walking with him. Kaken had plowed past them earlier, a glare on his face and a curl to his lip. Kirishima and Kaminari were hot on his heels. Deku kind of thought of Kirishima and Kaminari as Kaken's own personal fan club, though there was a horde of first years that seemed plenty eager to be a part of that fan club, even if that was something that Bakugo seemed to have zero interest in. "Ribbit, you were late into lunch today, Deku. Were you feeling sick?" Azui asked from the other side of Uraraka. Shaking his head, Deku explained, "Oh no, nothing like that. I was just talking with Mr. Aizawa about my future and the fact that I'm going to be quirkless soon." It hurt to explain, but Izuku was of the mind that the more he talked about it, the more he addressed this pain, the more accepting he'd become of it. Uraraka's head whipped in his direction at his words, her eyes wide with alarm. But did he was he thinking something specific? He didn't suggest you not be a part of the hero course, did he? The fear that he heard in her voice surprised him. Such a strong reaction from her was unexpected. "No, of course not. I wanted to talk to him to see if he thought me staying in the hero course was the best path for me. Being a hero without a quirk would be difficult to say the least," Deku said, hoping his words would help soothe some of the anxiety he saw on Uraraka's face. "You wanted to talk about it?" Uraraka stopped where she was, her eyes wide, her normally rosy cheeks taking on a sickly-looking pallor. Do you want to leave our class?" Her words were strained as if she just had the wind knocked out of her. Izuku stopped, turning to fully face her, disturbed by the expression on her face. No, I certainly don't want to. I just wanted to talk with him to see if he had any insights into what path my future should take. I wasn't talking to him to try and drop out or anything. Mr. Aizawa made it clear to me that he thinks I should stay in the hero course. I just wanted to get his take on things. Deku was relieved to see some color return to the Auburn's cheeks. Some of the anxiety in her face decreased. He watched as she took in a deep breath and then gave a brief nod. Is the thought of me not being in our class anymore that stressful to her? What? Okay, I was just making sure. I don't think you should leave the hero course, Deku. Even if you lose the embers of one for all, you've done so much and you helped so many people, it'd be. Her voice trailed off and he watched as her mouth moved but no words came out. Her brow knitted together and her mouth pressed into a frown. It'd be wrong for you to not be in the hero course. You're a hero regardless of having a quirk or not. A warmth flooded his tea and belly at her words. Uraraka? I agree, Deku. Staying with our class is the best thing. Ribbit, regardless of you having one for all or not, Azui agreed, interrupting Deku's warm and fuzzy feeling at Uraraka's words. I wasn't trying to leave, just getting his opinion, he reiterated. I was. His words were lost when the gravelly and irritable voice of Bakugu cut in. Hey Knuckles, hurry up and catch up. I want to eat dinner pronto and it's your turn to cook icy hot. The petulant blonde shouted at them from further up the path, at the entryway to their dorm. That was very rude. Chastised Ida, who was in between Deku, Uraraka, Azui and Bakugu, Todoroki at his side. And uncouth, agreed Todoroki in a cool voice. Oh, get F4 eyes and icy hot. I'm starved. Come on cheeks, hops a lot, and Deku, pick up the pace. He said with a sneer before heading inside. Kirishima and Kaminari followed suit. Ribbit, I'm surprised he even waited before going in, Azui said in a quiet voice before turning to look at Deku and Uraraka. I'm gonna go catch up to him and make sure he doesn't harass whoever is already in the kitchen. See you inside. Deku watched as she jogged on ahead, past Ida and Todoroki and to the dormitory. Todoroki and Ida followed after her, leaving Deku and Uraraka alone on the path. Uraraka had started walking again once the others were well ahead of them, causing Deku to take several rushed steps to catch up to her. He glanced briefly at her face to assess for any lingering anxiety and was relieved to see that the expression she wore now seemed mostly neutral. I feel bad that I caused her stress. Sorry I made you worry. That definitely wasn't my intention, he explained as he walked by her side. It was mid-September now, and while the stifling heat and humidity of the summer had mostly worn off, a bit of the warmth still lingered. He'd shed his blazer the moment he'd left the campus, eagerly tucking it into his backpack. Deku took in the girl at his side and briefly wondered how she could still be wearing hers, especially when combined with her leggings. Ochako gave him a bright and cheery smile. Oh, that's okay. I'm just glad you're staying with us is all. While her face looked upbeat and on the surface was the picture of joy, he felt there was a deeper emotion beneath its surface. He didn't get the same vibes that he'd picked up from her when they returned to school after the war, but they definitely got the impression that there was something else going on in her mind, making her cheerful smile nothing more than a mask. He opened his mouth to say something but stopped. Not everyone was willing to open up about things that were bothering them. Sometimes you had to be the one to open up first. Part of the reason I went there was because I'm not sure that I feel like I can be a full-time pro after everything that's happened. He paused, considering his next words. After everything with Tamura Shigaraki, I guess my wants for being a hero sorta changed. I don't think I want to be a full-time hero if it means that I lose someone like that again. Uraraka looked at him, their eyes briefly meeting before his skirted away and a blush began to form on his cheeks. How so? Don't be too serious, he cautioned himself. Well, I'm going to lose one for all, so being a hero without a quirk is kind of a huge obstacle, and that thought got me thinking about things that I can do that aren't highly reliant on a quirk but still let me live my dream. That's largely why I went to Mr. Aizawa. I wanted to see what he thought I should do. What did he have to say? Ochako asked. He suggested that there are other ways to be a hero than the traditional route, and he's totally right. Think about it. Every day we rely on people like doctors, nurses, teachers, counselors that sure, probably use their quirk to assist in what they do, but it isn't what defines them. They're still doing something heroic and really difficult, and even though it's not as cool or flashy as being like All Might, it's an honorable and giving line of work. It's helping people at the most basic level. In fact, it is sometimes those roles that identify and solve a problem so that it never grows to the point of needing a pro hero, and I like that idea. It makes accepting being quirkless and not being able to be a solo pro a lot less depressing. It's still helping people because no matter what, that's what I want to do the most, Deku explained as he raised up his right hand to briefly look over the highly scarred skin. His hands were hardly recognizable on some days, but that didn't matter. They were the hands of a hero, of a healer. And they're my reminder of you. Even though you decayed my arms and fought me at every turn, I still tried my best to save you, to touch that sad little lost boy inside of your heart. I hope I set him free in the end. Deku turned his gaze from his hand back to Uraraka and was surprised to see a look of pure awe on her face. He could make out what looked like the beginnings of tears pooling in her eyes. What had he said that would warrant that response? What did he say that made her want to cry? Just as he opened his mouth to begin speaking in an effort to soothe those unshed tears, he saw her mouth pull into a gentle smile. It was genuine, a tender little expression that made his tea and belly fill with warmth again, which he was vaguely confused by. I get that. After fighting with 𝗵𝗃𝗃 and finding out about her pain in her voice wavered briefly, her eyes dropping to the ground. Her sacrifice for me, it changed my wants for being a hero too. Izuku stopped walking and gave the auburn-haired girl a long look. I remember you saying that you wanted to become a pro hero because it would allow you to help your parents, financially, but you're so giving too that I know that that's part of it too. What else changed? He could still see the unshed tears in her eyes and wondered if whatever she was about to tell him would cause them to fall. He hoped not. It was all about that to begin with, yeah, but coming to UA and meeting you, everyone, it changed that, and then she changed that too. I think I'm a lot like you, Deku. Just like when we talked before the final war and we both thought we were kind of weird in that we wanted to help villains, I think that's what I want to do more than ever now. I want to help find the 𝗵𝗃𝗃s out there and help them find acceptance and happiness. To find a safe, good place where they can feel they belong so that they don't have to face the kind of adversity she faced. Her life would have been so much different if she just had someone there for her. Someone who showed her what real love is and taught her that it's okay if you're a little different, showed her that there's good in the world and not just bad. I want to be a hero, someone like All Might, but more than that, I want to be someone who helps children that are hurting and afraid so that they don't grow up with hearts that have only no hatred and suffering, she explained, her voice quiet but radiating an undercurrent of passion. The sentiment was so powerful that it left Deku speechless. Her mirrored his own so completely. We're so similar and she's so great. She really is my hero, he thought to himself as he felt his own eyes start to sting with tears. Blinking them away, he nodded at her. I think that's a really good goal, Uraraka, and I think that regardless of if you sort of mix things like Mr. Aizawa does and maybe one day me, or if you want to go do a solo pro hero route, either one you choose you'll make it happen. And you'll be good at it too. He smiled at her, his heart feeling light like a feather. He'd smiled so broadly at her that he'd closed his eyes in joy, and now opening them, he realized that she was staring at him, her cheeks a bit pinker than usual, her eyes almost starry looking. Uraraka? The starry-eyed expression cleared and she blinked at him and then briefly shook her head as if that was helping to reorient her. Sorry? Yeah, all good. Shall we head in? She asked, her cheeks still rosy with embarrassment. Is she flustered? Sure, he agreed. The two began walking side by side toward the dormitory, making light conversation between themselves. Despite their easy chatter, there was a tension in the air that neither of them really understood or was willing to acknowledge. If it had been left to them, they probably would have danced around an unspoken shared truth for years to come. But there were others that had no intention of letting either Izuku Midoriya or Ochako Uraraka avoid the elephant in the room any longer. Katsuki Bakugo sat in a desk chair that he didn't find particularly comfortable, eyes narrowed and a scowl on his face as he looked at his classmate 𝗬𝗎𝗎 who sat across from him, perched on her bed, a contemplative expression on her face. She still wore her school uniform, much to his annoyance, and had a hand up by her face, index finger resting at the corner of her mouth. It was well past 8 o'clock now and dinner had long since been had, and he would have been happy to turn in for the night or practice some of his physical therapy exercises for his right arm, but no, the 𝗵𝘃𝗲 had texted him for an urgent discussion, and here he was. Whatever urgency she'd suggested to him really didn't seem all that urgent, though. When he arrived about 10 minutes before, he'd done so with a carefully manicured outward appearance, irritable expression, hands in his pockets, the picture of impatient and poor-mannered Katsuki, but that was all a guise for the real reason he was showing up at the frog's dorm room, or so he'd thought. The moment he'd walked in, he'd been sporting impressive wood, she'd ushered him into the room and then forced him to assist her with chemistry. 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 What a joke. Now they were through the majority of their lesson, she decided that they needed to talk. That was really what he was looking for. 𝗵𝘃𝗲, pay attention, the frog commanded, making Katsuki look at her with a gaze that reeked of annoyance. I am talking about the nerd and cheeks. Yeah, I get it. What you want to do about it? He snapped as he pulled a hand out from one of his pockets and began inspecting his nails. Not even a chub anymore. Leave it to F molecules and chemical equations to be a buzzkill for 𝗵𝘃𝗲. 𝗵𝗲𝗍𝗄𝗧. 𝗵𝗃𝗲. 𝗵 round face. Goddamn pussyfooting around the obvious little beaches. 𝗵moles. 𝗵hydrocarbons. 𝗵chemistry. 𝗬𝗍𝗄𝗧 shifted on her bed so that her legs dangled off the edge where she delicately crossed them. Katsuki didn't even try to catch a glimpse up her skirt. What was the point? It wasn't like he was going to get any action, so why be a perv and spy on whatever she had going on underneath that skirt? Why get excited when there was no payoff? She clearly had invited him here for an academic discussion, and now a discussion involving his poor, stupid, oblivious nerd friend Deku and her emotional, repressing, stupidly round-faced friend Uraraka. I think Ochako needs to confess to Deku, 𝗬𝗍𝗄𝗧 said in a soft voice. Katsuki made a show of rolling his eyes at her statement. You know it's Sherlock, but you can lead a horse to water, doesn't mean you can make the dumb F drink, he said with a grunt as he began looking at his other hand. His right arm was almost entirely wrapped in a heavy-duty compression sleeve that was honestly closer to a cast than a regular compression sleeve. He was required to keep it on all the time aside from when he was showering or in PT. It was a never-ending annoyance for him having the stifling, thick thing covering his arm. It limited his mobility by an obnoxious amount and had been hot as hell to wear during the summertime, but it was a necessary evil if he wanted to forego losing his arm altogether. He'd been told that his rehab would likely take a full year if not something closer to 18 months. Both were things he'd not wanted to hear, especially since it required he spend 2 hours 3 times a week with a physical therapist. Annoying. Not to mention he was still going to weekly sessions of cardiac rehab. The damage that Shigaraki had inflicted to both his cardiac and pulmonary systems was severe. If 𝗵𝘃𝗲 hadn't nearly killed himself as he attempted to resuscitate and repair him, he likely would have come back with some sort of hypoxic brain injury or with full-blown heart failure. As it was, his heart's ejection fraction was lower than it should be, his pulmonary function impaired, and he'd had to be on a temporary regime of medications for his heart and for his pulmonary system so that his heart and lungs could fully heal with as little stress as possible. He also suffered irregular heartbeat on occasion, which also required medication. He'd been told by the cardiologist that it likely wasn't permanent and that good attendance to cardiac rehab would help his overall cardiac and pulmonary function. He'd managed to get down to only needing to go to cardiac rehab once a week, but it was still more often than he liked. The addition of multiple pills to take in a day was also an unpleasant side effect. He wasn't taking as many cardiac meds as he had been when he'd first been discharged from the hospital and had managed to no longer require pills for pulmonary hypertension, but he was still on more meds than he felt like a 17-year-old boy should be. Ribbit, pay attention. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 felt something warm and wet slap up against his face. He whipped his head in her direction to see her tongue now poking out the corner of her mouth. What the F? He snarled and leaned forward to glare at her. I was paying attention. You want Round Face and Deku to confess to each other, and I was agreeing with you but saying that you can't force them to do that. They're like idiots that are just gonna keep pussyfooting around the obvious until they're old and gray. Can't be helped. Well, I have a plan for that, but it requires your help, 𝗬𝗎𝗍 explained. I'm here, aren't I? Wanna share your plans with the rest of the class? 𝗵𝘃𝗲 asked with an eye roll. Katsuki watched as 𝗬𝗎𝗍 stood up from the bed and began to make a show of undoing her tie. Why was she even still dressed in her school uniform? They'd been back in the dormitory for hours now. Why stay in that stuffy, pompous uniform? He'd shed his nearly the moment he'd arrived back at the dorm. Well, maybe it was a chick thing. 𝗬𝗎𝗍 finished removing her tie before tossing it back onto her bed, now making a show of unbuttoning the first few buttons of her shirt. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 spared it barely a glance. Clearly she'd invited him not for a romp but for some harebrained scheme. No point in getting excited over nothing. I think we should help them to realize how they feel, or at least, encourage them to confess to each other, she explained as she faced Katsuki, her hands lacing behind her back. What did you have in mind? Lock them in a room for an hour. Fat lot of good that'll do. You could lock them in a locker for an entire night, and I still don't think that'd be enough for Deku to wake up and see the obvious, let alone enough time for Cheeks to acknowledge her feelings. Round face has future repression depression written all over her round butt face, snorted the blonde. No, ribbit, 𝗬𝗎𝗍 croaked, her brow furrowing. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 laughed at her reaction. What? Was that actually your plan? The amphibian quirked girl frowned at him. No, that was not my plan. I just didn't like what you were saying about Ochako. She doesn't well, she'd a little. Chicks got repression written all over her. Gonna cause problems in the future, but whatever, 𝗵𝘃𝗲 said and sighed, his hands returning to his pockets. So, if that wasn't your plan, then what is? Still frowning, she explained, I'll invite Ochako to the nearby amusement park this weekend while you invite Deku to the same amusement park. We set up the same date and time and agree to meet at a specific spot, but we never actually go to meet them. We set it up so that they are alone, together, the perfect scenario for a first date, or ribbit, a confession. Crimson eyes stared at the dark-eyed girl, incredulous and amused at the same time. What an absolutely stupid plan. As if that would work. Locked in a closet together or set up for a romantic amusement park crepe date, those two would never SHT or get off the pot. Of that 𝗵𝘃𝗲 was certain. Then again, if they were left to their own devices, then chances were they could easily go years, possibly even decades, without ever coming clean about their feelings. Deku seemed oblivious, albeit oblivious in such a way that it was obvious to everyone but him, and Katsuki was fairly certain that his friend would remain that way until it was far too late, and then when he did realize it, would probably carry a torch for Uraraka until the day he died, AF waste. Meanwhile, Cheeks seemed incapable of acknowledging or acting on what were clearly romantic feelings. He didn't have a clue, but he felt like she'd carry this quiet love for the nerd until pressure to get married to some random loser mounted and she had to bury her true feelings completely, making any hope of them confessing to each other and acting on their feelings impossible. That's a pretty stupid plan, he said at last, eyes narrowed. Even though it was a stupid plan, it wasn't like he had a better one. 𝗬𝗎𝗍 was at least trying to find a way to make the two idiots own up to their feelings. Ribbit, do you have a better one? She asked, her voice deadpan. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 huffed in annoyance. No, but there's a problem in your plan. If I ask Deku to go to the amusement park with me, that's gonna look really obvious. But your friends know, she started, but 𝗵𝘃𝗲 hissed, silencing her. Yeah, kinda, but me just asking him to go to the amusement park with zero pretense is, well, it's weird, Katsuki snapped. While Deku might be oblivious to his feelings for Uraraka, Katsuki somehow imagined that if he asked just Deku to go accompany him to the amusement park, he would be instantly suspicious and on his guard. Their relationship was much better than it had been, but randomly asking his former frenemy to go to the amusement park seemed out of character. 𝗬𝗎𝗍 lowered her eyes in thought as she took a few quiet steps closer to where 𝗵𝘃𝗲 sat in her desk chair. Ribbit, you're right about that. Invite Todoroki too. You and the Shiketsu students went to an empty amusement park one time, didn't you? It would look less weird, I think, if you suggested Todoroki and Deku go with you. Especially since you three all did your work studies together. Rolling his eyes, Katsuki said, Oh great, ask Icy Hot too. Am I supposed to explain the plan to him too? Dude is about as clueless to those sorts of things as Deku is. I'd probably need to make a presentation just to fully explain it to him. I'll help you explain it if you want, but yeah, we'll have to explain things so he knows to not show up, 𝗬𝗎𝗍 said with a head nod. Well, guess it is going to be time to make some sort of PowerPoint presentation about romantic setups for dummies. Stellar plan. One problem, even if it all goes the way you want it to and they meet up, who's to say that they stay there and don't know, leave. Or go beat around the bush some more. Come on 𝗬𝗎𝗍, you know what they're like. 𝗬𝗎𝗍 took another step toward him so that only an arm's length of space remained between them. Her hands moved from behind her back to her hips where they started delicately moving against her hips. The movement drew Bakugo's gaze and he wondered what the hell she was doing until he realized that her shimmying was actually her attempting to remove her panties while still wearing her skirt. His eyes widened as he saw a pair of bright green panties start to fall down below her skirt and past her thighs only to land in a little pool around her ankles. She took a dainty step out of the discarded undies and leaned in closer to him. He thought to himself now that she was this close. He'd completely dismissed that this was a possibility, but if she was making a show of taking off her panties to him, well then, it was most definitely still a possibility. Wah. He started, but 𝗬𝗎𝗍 clucking her tongue at him made him immediately shut up. We'll be there, just on the sidelines, sort of trying to guide them in the right direction if it looks like they're going off course, she explained as she popped another button of her shirt, giving him the tiniest shot of the cleavage that waited beneath. Swallowing down the lump of excitement in his throat, he said, "That's awful. And shady as SHT. I don't even see how us just spying on them is going to point them in the right direction." 𝗬𝗎𝗍's hands moved to the elbow rests on her desk chair, resting on either side of Bakugo. She leaned closer. "Ribbit, leave that part to me. You don't have to worry about encouraging them to stay on track. You just have to help me make it happen by doing what I say." She was close enough that he could feel her breath on his face. "Bossy, aren't you?" he asked in a voice that he'd intended to sound mean but mostly came out as husky and horny. "Will you help me?" she asked in voice that sounded more like a purr than actual words. Bakugo stared at the dark eyes in front of him, acutely aware of the raging throb in his groin at her close proximity and the fact that she wasn't wearing panties. "Depends. You gonna sit on my face or not?" 𝗬𝗎𝗍 gave him a naughty smile, leaning closer so that she was almost nose to nose with the blonde. "Rip, are you gonna help me?" Part of Katsuki wanted to savagely tug the girl forward and into his lap and then onto his face, but another part was annoyed by her attempt at coercing him with something she knew he wanted. Their occasional trysts had been going on since they as a class had found Uraraka and Deku having a crybaby party at their old temporary housing. When Katsuki had stumbled into that, he'd assumed that they were having some sort of tear-filled love confession, but no, that was not what had been happening. They'd apparently just been having a mutual circle JRK of tears about the fact that the 𝗵𝗃𝗍𝗁 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗲 and 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗃 𝗧𝗪𝗏 were dead. But he knew it had something to do with the fact that those two seemed to possess a huge amount of compassion and love for others, to a fault in his opinion. Caring for your fellow man was good, but a villain was a villain, and at the end of the day, he felt like the deaths of Shigaraki and Toga were probably appropriate. He certainly wasn't going to shed tears over those losers, but that just wasn't the case for Mr. and Mrs. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 at the sunset needs a well to look at and ponder life's meanings. What a match made in heaven. A heaven for sensitive weenies. Following that class encounter, some sort of spark of longing seemed to ignite in 𝗬𝗎𝗍, causing her to approach him of all people. He'd been completely shocked when she'd first broached the subject with him and had outright refused, but in the days that had followed, he'd reconsidered it and eventually approached her again and agreed. It had been a weird few months, with the two meeting up on occasion for a steamy tryst. It certainly wasn't something Katsuki had thought would happen, especially with Tsuyu 𝗬𝗎𝗍, but here they were. That sounds like coercion, frog face. I don't take kindly to being coerced into anything, he snapped at her. He wasn't interested in really rebuffing her advancements or the coercion, honestly. It was more so about the principle it set. Katsuki Bakugo was many things, many of them abrasive and unpleasant, but he was not one to be manipulated or have something like SEC used as a bargaining chip. He was better than that, and frankly, so was she. I never said that I wouldn't sit on your face if you didn't help me. You really think I asked you here just to help me with chemistry homework? Her voice was coy and playful. Yeah, I do. Either that, or you asked me here to help with your homework and because you wanted to wrangle me into helping you get the nerd and cheeks to confess in some stupid harebrained plan, he thought to himself as he frowned at the dark-eyed girl. Yeah, I did think that. I came here with a hard-on that I know you saw and the first thing you did was pull out your chem text, talk about 𝗵𝗃𝗲. An impish smile pulled at the corners of Ajui's lips. Ribbit. I did do that, didn't I? Yeah, you did. Much to his surprise, Ajui closed the distance between their bodies and moved so that she was sat in his lap, her legs straddling the sides of him. The action was not what he'd been expecting and he was so shocked by it that all he could do was blink and stare at her in mute surprise. She leaned in close to his face again, her breath hot on his face. I asked you here because I do want your help with Deku and Ochako, but also because... Her voice trailed off as Katsuki watched as Ajui's tongue popped out of her mouth and ran sensually along the length of his cheek. Because I wanted to see you. And ride my face yeah. His thoughts were scrambling and going wild in his head. His ability to think coherently swiftly decreasing as teenage horniness took center stage in his mind. It took all of his restraint to not his hands out of his pockets and tug her forward, mashing their bodies together. His lips finding hers in a fiery and furious kisses, but he managed it. Truth be told, he was interested in spurring round face and the nerd into confessing to each other. If they didn't do it, then it was entirely possible that those two idiots would never own up to the truth. Something had to be done about it, even if Ajui's plans sounded stupid. I'll help you, but not because you're trying to stuck me. I'm doing it because that nerd and depression need to address this morbidly obese elephant in the room, he said in a gravelly, husky voice. The ache in his groin was growing more intense by the second. Now, for the love of God, sit on my face already. Who is 𝗬𝗵𝗲 to deny him? Part 2. Izuku Midoriya stood beside a large water fountain, his gaze directed downward at his phone and the unanswered messages he'd sent to both Todoroki and Kaken. All around him there were various people walking past or occasionally sitting on an edge of the massive fountain, but none of them were the people he was looking for. Just a few days earlier, Deku had been approached by Kaken about going to a local amusement park with he and Todoroki. The suggestion had perplexed him at first, Kaken suggesting they go do friendly activities and with Todoroki to boot. This seemed out of place. If Deku had been Kirishima, such an invitation would have made more sense, and even though their current relationship was far better than it had been in the past, there would always be an undertone of rivalry and violent tension between the two. Still, he'd brushed off any reservations he had since having a friendly outing to an amusement park with Kaken and Todoroki wasn't exactly something he got to do very often or at all. Why not make the best of it? It was Saturday now, and he'd arrived with time to spare at the location that Bakugo, Todoroki, and he had agreed to meet, and yet he was the only one here. He hadn't arrived that early, and when he'd left the dormitory, he'd been mildly surprised to find both Bakugo and Todoroki absent. He'd just assumed that they'd left well before him and that just meant that he needed to hurry and catch up. So where were they? He again glanced down at his phone and considered typing up another message. Kaken leaving him on read was far more expected than Todoroki, but here he was. The indicator that his messages to both Kaken and Todoroki had been read. Were they already on some ride together? Had they ditched him? That seemed unlikely. While he could see Kaken doing that, though that seemed cruel for him especially now that they were on good terms with each other, he couldn't see Todoroki doing something like that. There was no way that the half-cold, half-hot boy would ever willingly ditch Izuku when they'd previously arranged to meet, unless something catastrophic had come up, but even then, he was fairly certain that Todoroki would have sent some message indicating that. Were they? Deku? A female voice called out from behind him, causing him to whirl around in that direction. The voice had been instantly familiar to him and strangely sent a thrill of excitement low in his belly that he briefly found confusing. Behind him stood Ochako Uraraka, dressed in a cute straw-colored spaghetti strap sundress with a slate blue tie front camisole layering the bust of the dress. She was looking at him with wide eyes full of surprise. Her mouth was slightly agape, prehistoric pink phone in hand. Uraraka. But what a coincidence. he exclaimed and gave her a warm smile as he took a step closer to her. Have you by chance seen 𝗂𝗂𝗃 or 𝗬𝗪𝗏𝗧𝗏? I was supposed to meet them here like 10 minutes ago and I still haven't seen them. I've texted them both several times but I haven't heard back from them. Uraraka gave a gentle shake of her head. No, I haven't. I was actually supposed to meet 𝗬𝗵𝗃 here but I just got here so I'm just going to assume that she hasn't gotten here yet. Though, I didn't see her at the dorm when I left, and she didn't answer any of my texts when I messaged her on the train, but before I left she messaged me to just meet up here. Deku watched as the Auburn's gaze lowered to her phone, her eyebrows starting to knit together in confusion. Oh, you were supposed to meet 𝗬𝗎𝗓 here too. Do you know if you were also supposed to meet up with 𝗂𝗂𝗃, 𝗬𝗪𝗏𝗧𝗏, and me too? They didn't mention that anyone else was coming or that they'd invited anyone else, but if you were supposed to meet 𝗬𝗎𝗓 here too, well that seems like more than coincidence. Izuku paused briefly to look over the large fountain. It was a rather large landmark for the amusement park, a logical marker for anyone looking to meet up at. Though I guess this water fountain is kinda big and unique. It would make sense to choose it as a meeting place. No, she didn't say anything like that. She just asked me if I wanted to go to the local amusement park with her this Saturday and then later to meet here at the fountain at this time, Uraraka explained, her eyes moving from Deku to roam over the crowd of people. Deku nodded at her words, his gaze also flicking to the throngs of people, his eyes searching for a familiar face. It didn't seem to matter how long he looked though, none of the faces he saw were the ones he was hoping to find. He returned his gaze to Uraraka before looking at the fountain and then back to his phone again. This all seemed rather strangely intentional. A new thought blossomed in his mind as he again read over his unanswered messages and glanced toward the girl beside him. What if they set this up? No, that's ridiculous. But is it? You've sent half a dozen messages to both 𝗂𝗂𝗃 and 𝗬𝗪𝗏𝗧𝗏 and neither of them have responded, which is not in character for at least 𝗬𝗪𝗏𝗧𝗏. Uraraka was invited to this exact same place at the exact same date and time only for 𝗬𝗎𝗓 to not show up. Uraraka says that 𝗬𝗎𝗓 hasn't answered her messages either. What if they planned this? But what? Why would all of them go to such lengths just to get Uraraka and I to go to the amusement park together? Together and alone. Why all this fuss just for something that really shouldn't be a big deal? His gaze swept over the short girl, causing another little trill of excitement to bounce around in his belly, which confused him. Why was looking at her making him feel excited? Where did this excitement stem from? Izuku continued to look at her, his brow creasing with concentration as he attempted to identify why he had butterflies in his stomach, why their friends would try to set them up alone and together, and what the ultimate goal of such a setup actually was. Wheels that had never really turned in his head before this moment began to slowly start to move. Setting us up to be alone and together at an amusement park is or could be like a date setup. The moment his mind landed on that thought, he instantly shied away from it. Though this would be an ideal setting for a friendly friends date too. The playdate. There's lots of reasons to go to an amusement park together and it's completely innocent and platonic. Not necessarily like a real date, no, definitely not. The excitement in the pit of his stomach had slowly started to morph into anxiety as he considered that the situation they were in may very well be a setup for something that was not just a playdate. His eyes widened as he looked at Uraraka, as he really saw her. He took in her rosy cheeks, the smooth and silky tresses, the cute little sundress, the pale, unblemished skin. She was really quite pretty, appealing even. Had he really just never noticed that before? But if it's a date then I don't know. I don't know anything about dates. And Uraraka certainly doesn't think of me like that. I'm not sure I even think of anyone like that, he thought to himself in a small panic as the reality of this likely being a romantic setup was becoming more and more likely. What am I supposed to do if it is that sort of setup? I don't know how to go on a date with anyone. What do you do on dates? Hold hands and eat crepes. Embrace. Embrace. He was briefly reminded of Himiko Toga's love confession to him on the battlefield and he couldn't help but start to feel flushed and embarrassed. This was not that. It might be some sort of setup by their friends, but it wasn't a love confession or anything else remotely close to that. But if it was a date, then what was he supposed to do? Did he think of Uraraka like that? Did he want to "You're an idiot," a gravelly voice said from somewhere behind him, making him whirl around to find its source. It sounded familiar, painfully familiar. It's not his voice. It can't be he died, he thought to himself as his eyes searched the crowd. "Stop being such a baby. Date or not, just do your best, you little..." The gravelly voice said this time, sounding like it was right beside him. Izuku turned his head in the direction of the voice only to catch sight of two men walking nearby him, both smiling and chatting with each other. One was laughing, a laugh that sounded eerily similar to Tamura Shigaraki. "Just be chill, dude. You guys have been friends for ages, so just do what you do if you were on a friendly outing, except knowing that it's a date." "Not a huge difference, dude," the laughing man said in a voice that sounded similar but also vastly different from his memory of Shigaraki's voice. The two men kept walking and continued chatting. "It was just my imagination, I guess," Deku thought to himself as he watched the men merge into the crowd. It had sounded so like him though. It was so much crisper than his memories were of that voice. He wondered if with the passage of time his recollection of Shigaraki's voice would fade into oblivion altogether. "I'm not sure I want to forget it, that I deserve to forget it. Maybe I should just call Tsu," Uraraka said, interrupting Deku's thoughts, making him turn his mind and gaze back toward her. She was looking anxiously out over the crowd, her phone still in hand. "Date or not, just do your best." They may not have been his words, but the sentiment was a good one. Regardless of this being a setup or not, of an intention to inspire romance, he could still enjoy the amusement park, and he could enjoy it with Uraraka. Maybe it was a date and that was admittedly a scary thought, but if it was, how did that really change things? He was friends with Uraraka, and while the prospect of it being a romantic setup was intimidating, who said that it had to be that way? They could enjoy this outing as friends and have a fun time all by themselves, platonic or otherwise. "I'll do my best and we can have a fun time together as friends here at the amusement park," he thought to himself with a smile. He started to reach out to grab her hand but hesitated as another thought popped into his head. "I like her, she's my friend, my hero. If this was a date I wouldn't mind it at all. I think I'd even like that." He pushed that thought down deep. The implications of such a thought made his hands start to shake and a nervous excitement start to tap dance in the pit of his stomach. Best not to think such things. "Don't call Azui. How about we just go ride rides and play games ourselves? I'm not sure why they seem to have set us up like this, but why waste the opportunity? We can still have a fun time here," he said with a friendly smile and held his hand out to her. Uraraka looked at him carefully, her expression cautious, her phone clutched close to her. He saw uncertainty and hesitation in her face, which made something akin to anxiety shoot through him. Did she not want to do amusement park things with him? Was the implication of them being together and alone at an amusement park too extreme? But then, he saw her smile, her face lightening. She nodded at him and tentatively reached her hand out to him. "You're right. Let's go have a fun time together." Izuku practically peed in his when she took his hand in hers. Her hand was soft and warm and felt so pleasant against his skin. It was great. "I'm holding hands with a pretty girl. Get a grip. It's just a friendly handhold. You're just friends. She doesn't like you like that and you don't even know what you really feel for her," he scolded himself before turning away from the auburn-haired girl and moving toward the crowd. Their fingers weren't laced together and it was a loose handhold, but it was hand-holding all the same. It made him remember back to the bad time, when he'd first been brought back to UA and how all the evacuees had booed and demanded his removal. She'd stood by him that entire time, she'd held his hand. He thought to when he'd found her on that same hillside outside their temporary housing when they'd talked about being weird, and how she'd desperately tried to hide her anguish from him, how he'd reached out his hand to her then and how she'd eventually taken it and the comfort it offered her. This was not like those times. This was something different, but he wouldn't think about that right now, couldn't think about it. Thinking about the possible implications of it or of the entirety of their existing relationship was distracting, and right now, all he wanted was to enjoy the amusement park with Ochako Uraraka. The water fountain sat in the heart of the amusement park with multiple diverging paths to other locations of the park all meeting at it. On one such path that led to a portion of the amusement park called Spooky Town, sat Tsuya Azui, Katsuki Bakugu, and Shoto Todoroki on a park bench. They were far enough away from the fountain that anyone in and around it would never have picked them out. Aside from a pair of binoculars that 𝗬𝗎𝗍 was looking through, they looked like any other park-goers. Did you have to bring binoculars? 𝗬𝗍𝗍. Now it really seems like we're being creeps and spying on them. 𝗬𝗵𝗃 the blonde. I agree with 𝗵𝗃𝗲, this all seems very inappropriate, came the cool response of 𝗳𝗪𝗢𝗍, who was looking at 𝗬𝗎𝗍 with a frown on his otherwise emotionless face. 𝗬𝗎𝗍 lowered the binoculars and looked at the two boys. She felt bad for 𝗳𝗪𝗢𝗍 having to be involved, especially considering the fact that he'd been completely oblivious to the romantic elephant in the room in regards to 𝗬𝗧𝗪 and Deku. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 had been right about that, and it had taken quite a bit of persuasion to get him to play along with their plan to set Deku and 𝗬𝗧𝗪 up for a romantic evening. I didn't want to bring them, but it's the only way I can keep an eye on them without getting too close. It's just for the beginning. There was no guarantee that they'd stay in the park together or not leave immediately, but I think it's working. They're moving into the crowd and they look like they're holding Han. 𝗬𝗎𝗍 started but was cut off by 𝗵𝗃𝗲 snatching up the binoculars from her and raising it to his eyes. F off, no way, he said with a hiss as he moved the binoculars in the direction of their classmates. His mouth fell open when he did finally catch sight of them. F me, they are holding hands. No way, it's that simple. Then can we leave them to their business? We can still enjoy the amusement park and just avoid them, 𝗳𝗪𝗢𝗍 suggested, his tone cool but laced with an undertone of discomfort. Clearly, spying on his friends was not something he'd ever be comfortable with, even if it was all in an effort to get the two to move their relationship forward. Ribbit, we can do that, yeah, but we should probably still keep an eye on them. 𝗬𝗧𝗪 is stubborn about her feelings, 𝗬𝗎𝗍 nodded. And Deku is even more oblivious than you, icy hot. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 laughed as he handed the binoculars back to 𝗬𝗎𝗍. I don't know that I'd refer to him as oblivious. I think he is just very focused on his studies and becoming a hero. That requires a specific mindset, 𝗳𝗪𝗢𝗍 countered. Blah blah, all I hear is an excuse for failing to see the obvious, the blonde said with a sneer. Frogface, let's go ride the teacups and then we can check in on the crybabies. I wanna see icy hot get green at the gills from a baby beach ride. The teacups do not make me nauseous, the half-white-haired, half-red-haired boy said in his defense. You don't have to ride them if you don't want to, 𝗬𝗎𝗍 said, attempting to mediate. Oh, he'll ride them and he'll get green, especially when I can control the spinner. Come on, losers. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 exclaimed in excitement as he practically leapt off the bench and surged forward toward the ride he'd mentioned. Both 𝗬𝗎𝗍 and 𝗳𝗪𝗢𝗍 gave each other dubious looks before reluctantly joining the blonde. Ochako Uraraka stood next to Izuku Midoriya, the two standing in front an arcade that was built into the amusement park. Outside of the arcade were several claw machines that had an assortment of prizes to win if you could get the claw to latch onto the prize on the bottom of the machine and either knock it over the edge and into the drop box or snag it with the claw and maneuver it that way. It was a pretty standard money-wasting gimmick that Ochako was more than a little familiar with. She doubted that they would have spared the machines more than a glance, but an All Might action figure had caught Deku's eye. Now they stood before the machine, Deku practically salivating at the sight of the action figure. It looked like any other action figure that she'd seen, but the box declared it a limited edition and an accurate depiction of All Might in the Silver Age. Not that any of that really meant that much to her, but to Deku, it was apparently a siren song that couldn't be avoided. Uraraka looked from the neon lights flickering and flashing on the machine and to Deku, whose eyes were glued to the it. She couldn't help but smile at his boyish excitement. Her gaze drifted to the claw machine and then to the crowd around them. This was turning into a strange day. When 𝗬𝗪 had asked her to go to an amusement park with her, Ochako hadn't hesitated to agree. Having a nice weekend outing with her best friend was always a great idea. But then when the weekend had come and she'd gotten ready that afternoon, her friend had been nowhere in sight. She'd assumed that they would go together from the dorm to the train and finally to the park, but that hadn't happened. Once she'd realized that 𝗬𝗪 wasn't at UA, she texted her friend to see if something had come up, but 𝗬𝗪 had responded that she'd just left a little earlier and was already on her way and to meet as previously planned. So that was what she'd done, except when she'd gotten to the amusement park and found the large water fountain that she was supposed to find 𝗬𝗪 at, she hadn't been there, but Deku had been. She was surprised and more than a little flustered when she saw him there. What on earth was he doing there? But then it turned out that he was supposed to meet Bakugo and Todoroki at the same location she was supposed to meet Tsu. Coincidence? She really didn't think so, but what else could it be? She briefly entertained the thought that Tsu might just already be on some other ride but thought better of it. Tsu not waiting for her didn't fit her character, but then again, neither did standing her up altogether and ignoring text messages. Deku had seemed equally as perplexed by their situation and had looked rather frazzled and wild as he looked around them in search of the friends they were supposed to meet. However, they never managed to locate Azui, Bakugo, or Todoroki, which left Uraraka feeling like there was more to this situation than simply being stood up or having to cancel abruptly. It all felt staged or set up, and the longer Ochako thought about it, the more she thought it was likely that Tsu and possibly the others had engineered the situation for she and Deku to end up alone at the amusement park. But why? Because Tsu knows your feelings for Deku, and even though she's never said it to your face, you know she thinks you should confess to him. You constantly push down those feelings, ignore them, and she sees that. She probably is trying to help, she'd thought to herself before dismissing it and deciding that she should just call Tsu. Tsu could avoid their texts, but she'd have a harder time ignoring a direct phone call. However, she never got to make that call because Deku had reached out to her and had suggested that they just go together, as friends, and enjoy the amusement park. She'd been initially shocked by the gesture. Deku extending his hand to her to go on a romance-implied amusement park date. This was most definitely going to make her already tumultuous feelings all the more complicated and difficult to ignore, but his face had been so bright and happy, and even though a confession of her true feelings, let alone a date, were things that she hadn't planned or, and certainly wasn't planning on, intended to do, she couldn't refuse him. They could just go and enjoy the amusement park together as friends. And here they were, not having gone on any rides just yet, but just staring at the claw machine with the siren song All Might figure singing to Deku. She half wondered if she wasn't here if he'd move up to the glass of the machine and press his nose and face flush against it in an attempt to get a better look at the box and the treasures inside of it. At that thought, she had to refrain a giggle. "Do you want to try and get the All Might figure?" she asked in a conversational tone. Deku turned briefly to look at her, a blush coloring his cheeks. Yeah, I think I will. Sorry, it's not exactly a particularly fun park event for both of us." Ochako shook her head at his words. "No, it's okay, I don't mind. I haven't played at one of these claw machines in years, and I've never seen any of our classmates or, well, you, do them, so it'll be fun to see." Her arms were behind her back where her hands were laced together. Since they'd spotted the arcade, they'd separated and were no longer holding hands. It was a platonic handhold anyway, like one she'd have with Tsu or anyone else. That was perfectly okay. It was like when she'd held his hand when he'd come back to UA, or how he'd held her hand when she'd been unable to hide her grief over Himiko's death. That was all it was. Nothing more, and that was totally okay. Is that all it is? Do you want it to be more? What's wrong with wanting more? That same somehow alien voice from within asked her, making her mash her teeth together. Those kinds of thoughts, whether they were hers or whatever they were not helpful. This was a platonic friendly event. Her romantic feelings were fine where they were, buried. Deku had enough to worry about, what with facing the inevitability of being quirkless soon, not to mention he indicated that he was altering the course of his future, potentially pursuing something like teaching rather than full-time hero work. He didn't need her messy and complicated romantic feelings thrown into the enormity of changes he was facing. He doesn't need that, she thought to herself before another thought countered it. What if he wants it though? The sound of coins being slotted into the claw machine tore her from her thoughts. She blinked to clear her mind of her moody thoughts before focusing on Deku eagerly loading in 500 yen into the machine. I wonder how he does with claw machines. They're kind of difficult, but Deku seems to be good at most of the things he really sets his mind to. "Okay, here I go," he declared as he cast a nervous glance back at her. "I was never very good at these when I was a kid, and it's been quite a while since I played one, so it might not go well." Ochako smiled encouragingly at him. "You got this, Deku?" Uraraka watched as the first of 5 pulls activated and Deku sent the crane moving, attempting to move the boxed figure at the bottom of the machine that needed to fall into the drop box to win. She was mildly surprised that he hadn't gone for an outright attempt at picking it up with the claw. While it was bolder and riskier to attempt a snag with the claw, it was usually a better option than slowly attempting to push or ineffectually dragging the prize toward the drop box. Deku used his first pull to try and snag a corner of the box toy, essentially tipping it over and making it fall off balance and into the drop box, but that was a technique that rarely worked. The boxes were remarkably sturdy, and even if they were successfully knocked over, they rarely became so off balance that it'd topple into the drop box. You were lucky if you could get it to inch forward by anything more than a few finger widths. Deku's second and third pull were much the same as the first. He managed to move the prize a little closer to the goal, but it remained in almost the exact spot that it had started out in. 𝗬𝗧𝗵𝗃 wondered what his fourth and his final attempt would be. On the fourth attempt, he went for the more direct attempt and tried to grasp the box with the claw. This failed miserably and ended up moving the prize just a little bit further away from the drop box goal. That took a bit of unintentional skill to fail backwards like that. The final attempt was a repeat of his earlier attempts and ultimately ended up in failure. The machine beeped and flashed brightly, indicating his attempts were over. "Shoot," Deku said with a sigh before turning back toward her with cheeks that were rosy from embarrassment. "Guess I'm still not very good at these games." He laughed then, his arm moving behind his head to scratch nervously at his neck. 𝗬𝗧𝗵𝗃 stepped forward, a tiny little excitement building in her belly. "Do you want me to try?" Deku looked from 𝗬𝗧𝗵𝗃 to the machine and gave a shrug. "Sure, if you want to, but you don't have to just for me. It's a silly thing that I want. You don't have to waste your money on it, but actually, here, if you really want to try, then let me pay for it." He began to furiously dig into his shorts pockets to pull out more yen coins. Uraraka smiled and shook her head at him. "Don't worry about it, I've got it." She moved past him and daintily reached into the little handbag that rested on her shoulder. After pulling out a 500 yen coin, she inserted it into the machine and was greeted with several loud beeps and exciting flashing neon lights indicating her pulls were about to start. "Uraraka, I don't want you to have to waste your money for some silly toy for me. You don't have to, really," Deku said, moving up to her side, his brows knitted together with concern. But 𝗬𝗧𝗵𝗃 ignored him and instead began operating the crane. As she moved the crane into position, she paused briefly to look over at him and say, "When I was little, I never got a lot of toys because my parents were always financially burdened, but there was a lady that lived next door to us and she would give me 100 yen coins if I did certain chores for her. It was really the only allowance I got growing up because money was so tight for us." She turned back to the crane and urged it downward, the claws opening. "I'd save up my coins until I had 2,000 yen or so, and then I'd go down to the local arcade or any street vendor really and try to get as many gacha toys or crane game toys as I could. It was the only way I could reliably get new toys. Sometimes it was random and not something I actually wanted, but that didn't really matter all that much." Just as the claw attempted to close on the box that was far too square and large to give any secure grasp on the prize, it managed to snag the sharp corner of the box, causing it to flip upside down and closer to the drop box. Deku gave a quiet gasp at her success. She hadn't won yet, but she'd moved the prize farther than he'd ever managed to get it. Uraraka repeated this same move 3 more times until the prize balanced precariously on the edge of the machine's floor and the drop box before finally toppling forward and over the edge. More lights flashed brilliantly on the machine and a series of electronic-sounding beeps and buzzes began chiming from it. 𝗬𝗧𝗵𝗃 turned away from the machine and to Deku, a look of smug satisfaction on her face. Before she could explain her triumph though, the arcade owner trudged over to them before sleepily asking them what prize they wanted. She pointed to the all-might figure which he later procured for them from a back storeroom before disappearing into the depths of the arcade. 𝗬𝗧𝗵𝗃 held the prize out to Deku and smiled. "I was really bad at the claw machines for a long time, but it was one of the only ways that I could reliably get bigger toys if I got good at it. So, whenever I had a few extra 100 yen coins, I was down trying to get good at the claw machine. That's the only reason I was pretty confident about getting this for you. I've probably played at claw machines like this one since I was 5 years old," she explained, feeling a bit sheepish now that she'd won and awkwardly held the toy out to Deku. Deku looked at her with wide eyes before looking down at the all-might prize and gently taking it from her. She watched as he raised it up to his face and looked at it with huge, excited eyes. Slowly he lowered it down to abdomen level before looking back at her. The expression on his face made her instantly blush for reasons she wasn't all that sure of. Whatever the reason, the look on his face made her avert her eyes. "Thank you. Really, Uraraka. And I think that is so cool that you spent a lot of your childhood doing things like gotchas and the claw machine. When I was little and Kakin wasn't trying to beat me up, we would sometimes do games like the claw together or gotchas. That was actually where we got our All Might trading cards, from a lucky gotcha pull. I got mine signed by All Might basically the first time I met him. I should get that framed." Now Ochako did giggle, unable to stop herself from doing so thanks to his die-hard fanboy status. He really was All Might's #1 fan. Deku looked at her and blushed when he realized she was giggling. "Sorry, that was probably a really lame thing to say," he muttered. "No, it's not that. I just thought it was funny is all." "It was funny but a very you thing to say. I thought it was really cute," she explained but snapped her mouth shut after realizing she'd just unintentionally referred to him as cute, which definitely seemed like territory that wasn't platonic. "Cute?" Deku repeated, his eyebrows just slightly raised in question, head tilted to the side, a different kind of blush beginning to color his cheeks. "Oh no. Do or say something that isn't about him being cute, quick." Her gaze swept wildly away from Deku and to the crowd and various rides outside the arcade before landing on a little stand that offered Kingyo-sukué, goldfish scooping, for only 500 yen. She considered suggesting that they do that but decided that walking around an amusement park with live goldfish probably wasn't the greatest idea. Her eyes darted from the Kingyo-sukué stall to a nearby roller coaster. "Hey, wanna go on that roller coaster over there?" she asked in a rush, pointing in the direction of the ride. She'd barely spared more than a glance at the roller coaster, so had no idea what kind of coaster it was in terms of thrill and intensity. In truth, she wasn't that great a fan of roller coasters. She didn't mind them, but the ones with 90-degree drops and multiple upside-down spins made her head spin. Not to mention the motion sickness she was sometimes subject to when she rode a roller coaster, but it had been several years since she'd been on one, so it was entirely possible that her tolerance for them had increased, or so she hoped. Deku's gaze followed her pointing before landing on the attraction in question. His eyes flickered back to her, excitement in them. "That one. I've heard about that one before. It's supposed to be really intense. Right out of the gate you have like an almost 90-degree drop. It's supposed to be pretty wild." Ochako gave a false smile that she hoped was convincing enough to hide the stab of fear she felt in the pit of her stomach. Her suggesting the roller coaster had successfully diverted her statement about him being cute, but now she'd actually have to ride the thing, and she was less than keen on that. "Sure, let's go do it," Uraraka said with forced cheer. Again, she hoped that it was convincing. Deku started to move forward but paused to pull off his trademark yellow backpack to put his coveted All Might figure in it. Once he'd secured it, he slung it back over his shoulders and began moving forward. Uraraka followed after him, trying to squash the anxiety that was steadily building in the pit of her stomach. "It's fine, just close your eyes the whole time. It won't be so scary if you have your eyes closed the entire time," she thought to herself. Considering her quirk was zero gravity, Ochako was used to and enjoyed spending a good amount of time airborne, but that was somewhat controlled and rather gentle. Even with her grappling cables deployed, it was still airborne movement that she considered on the delicate side. She certainly wasn't pulling a strong combination of both positive and negative G-forces. Her usage of zero gravity was more akin to being in space, gently floating, the body rendered weightless. However, considering the fancy fast moves she'd seen Deku employ when he'd been the holder of a full-powered OFA, she was certain that he probably did enjoy those kinds of G-forces. As she trailed behind him, she tried to convert her anxiety into excitement. Excitement for Deku to be able to experience something sort of similar to the speed and force that he'd had when he had more than just the embers of OFA. She found herself a little less anxious thanks to these efforts, though still acutely aware of a pressing anxiety at the back of her mind. Just don't throw up, don't throw up. A memory of when she'd been 10 years old, the last time she'd been at an amusement park, came to mind where she'd gone on a roller coaster that was particularly intense and had promptly thrown up the second she stepped off the ride. Just don't throw up like that. You're so much stronger now and you hardly ever get nauseated anymore when you overextend your quirk. You've improved so much. The two made it up to the line and began filing into place to wait in line for the ride. 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 stood close to Deku, their shoulders almost touching. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 silence growing between them. She wasn't sure that he was aware of it, but she certainly was. You like roller coasters? Deku's voice interrupted her internal mantra of, just don't throw up. 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 turned to look at him and gave a half-hearted smile. I'm not a super fan of them, but they're, well, I don't mind them. Well, I used to get kinda motion sick with them when I was younger, but you know, I'm a lot more grown up now, so I don't think that'll be an issue. I mean, I hardly ever experience nausea anymore when using my quirk, which used to be a big problem, so I'm sure I'll be fine. She gave a nervous laugh before closing her eyes and smiling at him. I'm guessing you like them? Deku didn't answer right away and was quiet, making 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 open her eyes and look at him. He was looking at her with a knowing gaze that made her want to blush. What's he seeing when he looks at me like that? Has he figured out that I'm afraid I'm going to barf on this roller coaster? I like them, yeah, but if you aren't comfortable going on one, then we don't have to. I don't mind, really. Part of going to the amusement park with another person is doing things that you both like, and that's what I want to do. So, if you aren't into this ride, then we can do something else, he said in a comforting tone. Uraraka felt a little warmth start up in her belly at his words. His expression was kind and concerned, his eyes gentle. He was so sweet. It's why I have these feelings for him. It's why I fell in love with him. She felt her eyes widen at that thought and her cheeks start to burn with heat. Not a good time for those thoughts. Speak, say something to distract from that. I think that I'm okay giving it a try. I'm nervous, but I like the idea of being able to go on a ride with you that I know you like, so let's give it a try. She gave a timid smile before continuing, just be warned, I guess, I might throw up after. The last time I rode one I did throw up. The green-haired boy looked at her, his eyebrows knitted together with concern. Are you sure you want to risk that? I don't want you to get sick and have the rest of this trip strong for you because you feel nauseated. I actually took Dramamine before I left since riding on the train sometimes causes me motion sickness, so hopefully between that and being more grown up I'll be okay? The line began moving forward, bringing both Deku and Uraraka closer to getting into one of the train's cars. Uraraka stayed close to Deku. Her anxiety was a little bit better but still ever present. Admitting what she was anxious to him had helped her overall nervousness and made her more hopeful that she wouldn't blow chunks the second they stepped off the coaster. They moved as a pair in the queue so that they were next in line to get on the ride. 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 looked down at the ground and saw the number 3 written on it. So, they'd be in car number 3, that was far better than being in car number 1. Uraraka, you know, if you throw up after, I'll make sure to hold your hair back. It'll be okay, maybe even fun, well, not throwing up, but riding the roller coaster will be. Deku said in a comforting tone. 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 looked at him and again felt a warmth bloom in her at his words. You're so sweet, she thought to herself as she looked at him. I wish I could tell you how I really feel. What they had now was fine. There were far more important things than romance and love confessions. She was training to be a hero and that took priority. Her goal to ensure that the future 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗃s togas out there never had to endure what she had to was also more important. Frivolous things like adolescent romance were something she just didn't have time for. Besides, she had no interest in jeopardizing the friendship she had with 𝗧𝗵𝗲 and trying to move them from friends to romantic could very well do that. Things were fine the way they were. Wouldn't you like more? Uraraka resisted the urge to shudder at that alien inner voice. Was it her subconscious speaking to her? It didn't feel like her, but then again, she'd held on to these feelings for a long time and it was entirely possible that they refused to stay locked away any longer. Whatever the case, it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore them, especially when she was alone and an amusement park with him. The next car arrived with a gust of air and a loud whooshing sound as it came a sudden stop, the safety lifting up and the previous passengers exiting the ride. The gates opened a few seconds later and car number 3 beckoned. Deku moved forward first, easily sliding into the car and into the seat where he buckled a seatbelt over his waist. He looked over toward Uraraka, who still stood at the gate. The cars were two-seaters, so Ochako would be saddled right up next to Deku. Uraraka? He questioned. Ochako took wooden steps forward before sliding into the seat next to Deku and with shaky hands buckled her seatbelt. Her palms felt sweaty and her heart felt like it was starting to race. Was this because she was about to ride a scary roller coaster with a 90-degree drop, or was it because she was strapped into a seat and shoulder to shoulder with 𝗧𝗵𝗵𝗲? It was a toss-up. A brief safety announcement came on as a bored-looking custodian came around and began pulling the down over all of the riders. Ochako was only half paying attention as the safety announcement said that purses and other bags should be left behind, keep arms and feet inside, buckle seatbelts, etc. Your purse, Uraraka. You should leave it here. I'm leaving my backpack, Deku said, drawing Ochako's attention to him. She saw that one of the attendants had made it to their car and was looking at them, Deku's yellow backpack in their hands, their face impatient. Oh, right? She said with a nod and removed her purse and handed it to the attendant. Thank you, your bags will be here when you return, the custodian said in a bored, manufactured tone as they moved from Deku and Uraraka's car to the next one. The safety announcement finished as Uraraka watched the bored-looking teenager continue up toward the first car. She looked nervously over at Deku, who was watching her with a gentle smile on his face. It'll be okay. You've got this, he said reassuringly. Do you want to hold my hand, that is to, for her comfort? She once again thought of when he'd offered his hand to her when she'd been overcome with grief over Himiko's death and how it had been enough to soothe some of her pain. She wasn't in pain now, but she was nervous and more than a little scared that she'd throw up in spectacular fashion the second the ride finished. I think holding his hand would be nice. Yes, Uraraka said in a tiny voice as she rotated her hand out toward him, her palm open. There was a tiny blush in his cheeks as he looked at her and the beginnings of a nervous smile on his face as he gently took her hand into his. We've got this, he said confidently as the roller coaster suddenly surged forward at dizzying speeds. Ochako felt her stomach fly into her throat and fear flutter in her belly, but a quick side glance at Deku and the wide smile there, his forehead visible as the fast speeds tousled his hair, made her find a smile of her own. That is, until they went over the first drop, then all Ochako could do was scream. Todoroki, Bakugo, and Azui stood nearby the roller coaster that they'd seen Deku and Uraraka get on just a short time before. Todoroki was only paying the ride mild attention, his face tinged with a green color and a hand on his belly as he dealt with lingering nausea from the teacup ride and Bakugo's relentless and wild spinning of the kiddie ride. Bakugo was looking at the roller coaster and grinning. Clearly, he was interested in riding it. Azui was looking at the ride with concern, acutely aware of her friend's motion sickness and history with puking because of that sickness. Why'd you agree to go on this ride, Ochako? She mused mostly to herself. There were choruses of screams echoing from the roller coaster as all three looked up at the ride as it twisted, rolled, and dropped repeatedly. If the teacups didn't make you blow chunks, then this beach will for sure. Come on, icy hot. Let's get you to toss those cookies once and for all. Bakugo said with a wicked grin and slapped Todoroki on the shoulder with his bad hand. It was in its usual restrictive compressive device, but even with that in place, the movement of playfully slapping Todoroki made him briefly wince. The movement was not lost to Azui, who frowned when she saw his face briefly contort in pain. Without even thinking about it, she whipped her tongue out, using it to gently slap Bakugo across the back. The blonde didn't even stumble but instead looked back at her with a venomous glare. What the F? He snapped, moving away from the clearly seasick Todoroki to get into Azui's face. You know you aren't supposed to do any strenuous activity with that arm, rib bit. So don't, Tsu chastised, refusing to move or back down despite the fiery blonde's close and threatening proximity. Slapping icy hot. That wasn't strenuous, F off. He growled before turning back to Todoroki. Once the crybabies get off and we give them a good 10 minutes to F about, we're riding it icy hot. Froggy, you can tag along or stay behind. I don't actually give a F since you have a cast iron stomach and I doubt this coaster or any coaster would make you yak, Bakugo said, moving to Todoroki's side, his gaze on the ride, eyes wide with excitement. Todoroki cast a confused look at Bakugo and then at Tsu. How do you know she has such a strong stomach? The teacups might not have made her sick, but a roller coaster delivers an entirely new thrill and nauseating factor. And while you might think that riding a roller coaster will make me sick, there's a strong chance you're wrong. Spinning seems to make me sick, or rather, spinning rides that spin excessively seem to make me nauseated. I have no reason to believe that a roller coaster would cause the same phenomena. Despite the fact that Todoroki's statement was mostly centered on defending his potential upchuck factor on a roller coaster, Azui couldn't help but feel her cheeks grow warm with embarrassment. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 talking about her having a cast iron stomach indicated a familiarity that she wasn't comfortable with anyone knowing about. Not that 𝗵𝘃𝗲 should have an abundance of knowledge on how she tolerated thrill rides. It wasn't like the time they spent together was riddled with long, heartfelt conversations. It was all much more physical than that. She can barf up her own stomach. If that doesn't spell iron stomach, I dunno what does. Now shut the F up about how you aren't going to spew. We won't know till we try, dipshit. The blonde said with a snort. Nice save, Azui thought to herself. Ribbit. We should move away from the roller coaster for now. I think the ride will have ended and we don't want to be seen lurking. I think we should. Todoroki started but stopped briefly to clench his middle, one of his hands going up to his mouth. I need a bathroom or a trash can now. Both Azui and 𝗵𝘃𝗲 watched as the taller boy started sprinting away from them, a hand clapped over his mouth. 𝗵𝘃𝗲, 𝗵𝘃𝗲 snickered before following after him. Azui spared one more glance at the roller coaster before heading in the same direction as the two boys had gone. She doubted that any sort of love confession had happened so far, but that was okay. If it looked like Ochako wasn't about to throw up post-roller coaster, then Tsu had one last trick up her sleeve to help set the scene. Deku felt like he was practically bouncing with excitement as he picked up his backpack and grabbed Uraraka's purse and handed it to her. The roller coaster had been so much fun. It had been fast and intense, and the drops it provided were some of the most intense he'd ever experienced on a roller coaster. It had made him feel a little like he still had an intact OFA and was flying through the air with Black Whip or just with Air Force alone. It of course wasn't really all that much like OFA had been. The speeds he could get to when he'd had OFA completely unlocked were something akin to the fastest fighter jets, but it was close enough. He could still achieve super speeds even with just the embers, but he was trying to use it as little as possible considering he knew he was on a time limit until it was altogether gone. He cast a look at the auburn-haired girl and was relieved to see that she was smiling and that it looked genuine. She'd clearly been very nervous about riding the roller coaster and had admitted to him that she suffered motion sickness, which was something he hadn't thought of before. He knew that she'd previously suffered nausea when overusing her quirk, but their time at the summer camp had improved that limitation within her. Maybe she just needed a little encouragement, he thought to himself as he pulled his backpack over his shoulders as he recalled how she'd willingly taken his hand. They'd held hands. But no, it had just been a nice, friendly, and comforting handhold. It was the type of gesture that he'd offer to anyone that he knew was afraid and in need of comfort. Thinking about holding her hand on the coaster made him think of her briefly referring to him as cute, which made butterflies start dancing in his belly. Well, she wasn't saying I was cute, just what I was saying was cute. There's a difference. She doesn't think that I'm cute or like good-looking or something. That is not what she was implying, but what if it was? That thought echoed in his head as the two exited the ride and stood in the warm autumn air. Izuku looked over at Uraraka, who was looking out over the crowd. She didn't look green or pale, so hopefully she wasn't feeling sick. How do you feel? Any motion sickness? He asked. Uraraka's brown eyes flicked back to him and then away before responding. Surprisingly, no, I actually feel okay. That's great. I was worried about you, Deku exclaimed with relief. So, any ideas for what else you might want to ride or do? He watched as Uraraka looked from him to the crowd and then at nearby rides and attractions. Deku repeated this behavior, looking around their surroundings as he considered what he might want to do too. I'll have to eat something eventually. I'm not very hungry right now. Or at least I don't feel hungry right now. I wonder if she's hungry. If she is hungry, what should we eat? 𝗵𝘃𝗃, no, not that. That's too date-like and this is not a date. His gaze moved wildly around them before getting stuck on the large, imposing shape of a Ferris wheel. Oh, the Ferris wheel is a great idea. We can just sit up there and talk a little and see all the different rides from up in the sky. We could probably even see a few different food places that we could try out too, he thought to himself as he turned his gaze back toward Uraraka. Do you want to ride the Ferris wheel together? He asked, his voice excited and eager. The Ferris wheel? Uraraka repeated, her eyes moving from his face and in the direction of the unmistakable ride. I haven't been on one in years. Yeah, I think I'd like that. Deku smiled at her, pleased that she was receptive to his suggestion. Come on, he said and motioned for her to follow after him. The two merged into the crowd of park goers. The crowd hadn't been that bad when he'd first gotten here, but it seemed like more people had arrived between now and then. He found himself often bumping shoulders with people and had to continuously look back to make sure that Uraraka was still nearby. In such a large crowd it was easy to get separated. Maybe for practical purposes we should hold hands again. Hey Deku, I'm gonna grab hold of the back of your backpack, okay? That way we can avoid getting too far away from each other. Ochako called out to him over the noise pollution of other amusement park goers. That works too, he thought to himself as he looked back at her and nodded. There was a small tug of disappointment that he was vaguely aware of, which he briefly wondered about before dismissing it as irrelevant. With Uraraka holding onto his backpack, Izuku weaved them through the crowd and closer to the Ferris wheel. His mind began to wander as they got closer to it. What would they talk about? Would they sit silently as they looked out over the theme park? Would they discuss what they should eat? Would they talk about school? Would they talk about their futures or their pasts? What did he want to talk about? He wasn't sure. Finally, they arrived at the queue for the Ferris wheel and both were mildly surprised to find it relatively empty. Apparently, a ride as tame as a Ferris wheel just wasn't as popular as all the other attractions that were available. Well, a short line means basically no wait time, cool. After just a few short minutes they'd made it through the line and were ushered into one of the wheel's booths by the ride's attendant. The attendant shut and locked the little booth door once both Deku and Uraraka were seated. They sat in silence as their little booth rocked forward and higher as other park attendees were ushered onto the ride. When they'd first entered the booth, they'd not hesitated to sit across from each other, neither bold enough to sit beside the other. Such a forward gesture would potentially be indicative of romance, and that was not something either of them were ready to admit existed between them. Deku sat awkwardly across from the auburn-haired girl, his gaze bouncing wildly from her face to her dress to his knees or out the little booth window. He was painfully aware of the silence between them and of the close proximity that the booth encouraged, but this wasn't romantic and they were just friends. Just friends. Definitely just friends. What more was there? What more was needed? Before Deku's mind could answer that question though, the wheel suddenly started up and their booth slowly began to ascend over the park. Izuku turned his gaze to the window and began looking out over all the attractions. He imagined that if they were here after dark or even at twilight that the park would be lit up with hundreds of lights and would be very pretty, especially from up in a Ferris wheel. Since it was only midday, those lights were currently invisible under the brightness of the shining sun. Deku doubted that they'd stay at the park long enough to see the lights come on. Even if they rode every single ride in the park twice, there'd still be plenty of sunlight left in the day. Does the scar you got from Shigaraki, does it still hurt you? Uraraka's question pierced through his thoughts, causing him to look from the window to her. She was sitting cross-legged, hands in her lap, and a delicate flush in her cheeks. Izuku tentatively raised a hand up to his scarred cheek. The skin felt jagged and rough, thick and thin at the same time. The sensation was different there too, not entirely intact, as if it were permanently altered to some extent. He wondered if that would be a forever thing. The massive scar on his right arm sometimes ached with weather changes or with strain, though the sensation didn't feel all that different from the rest of his skin. Deku ran a hand up along the right side of his face and brow and into his hair. The shaved part of his head had mostly regrown. It was just a little bit shorter than the rest of his hair, but aside from that it was almost invisible that a portion of his head had been shaved bald not long before. No, it doesn't hurt me. I guess that might change when winter comes. Sometimes the scar on my right arm hurts when the weather changes. The sensation on my cheek, or well, centered around the scar, is a little different than the rest of my skin now. It doesn't hurt, It's like it just feels muted, I guess. The doctors told me that it should fade and shrink a little with time and age. I just will have to avoid spending a lot of time in the sun, or I guess that could make it worse, Deku explained, his hand dropping from his face and to his lap. Uraraka nodded at him, her gaze shifting from him and to the window, her expression somehow far away. He watched as one of the hands in her lap shifted and tenderly touched a spot on her belly, likely somewhere above and slightly to the side of her belly button. "My scar is a lot easier to hide than yours," she said in a soft voice as she looked out the window. "It still hurts on and off, regardless of weather. My parents made me see a doctor about it, and they told me that gut wounds, or really any sort of stab wound to the abdomen, can hurt for a long time after, even after everything has healed. I like to think of it as just my little reminder of everything that's happened." Deku gave a slight head nod of understanding. He didn't feel like the scar on his face was his reminder of that last fight, but rather, the multitude of scars and marred skin covering both his hands, evidence of him withstanding decay and the subsequent gift Ares' horn gave him. Sometime after everything had gone down and after Ares had sung for them, she'd asked him if he wanted her to rewind him further so that his arms were less scarred. Deku had smiled and declined. The energy required for that would be a lot, and it was still unclear if her quirk was negatively affected by her breaking off her horn for him to use. That, and he viewed his scarred hands and arms as poignant reminders of what had happened, what he'd lost that day. Holding up his hands, Deku said, "I kind of view my hands and arms like that. I should have lost them, I did lose them. Shigaraki, Tenko, he decayed them, but I held on and it destroyed my arms. If it wasn't for Ares' horn, then I'd be armless," he said in a soft tone as he looked over his marred flesh. "I like to think of them as my reminder." He paused to give a sad little smile. "You know, Ares offered to rewind them so that they wouldn't be so scarred. I think she was afraid that they hurt me, but I said no because I felt like they were scars that I needed to wear and needed to see every day. They tell a story so that I can never forget what happened that day." There was a silence, and then in a hushed and sensitive tone, Uraraka said, "That must have been terrible to have lost your arms." "I can't imagine. I'm sorry, Deku." Deku gave a small shrug of his shoulders. It wasn't pleasant. In truth, it had been awful and painful and terrifying, but he refused to let go of that scared, desperate little boy. No matter the cost, and the cost had been enormous, he was bound and determined to keep hold of that terrified child, to touch that broken heart that gave birth to Tamura Shigaraki. "But I can't imagine that getting stabbed was much better. You almost died." Deku had been occupied with his own fight when Uraraka had taken on 𝗵𝗃𝗃, but he'd heard what had happened. He knew that she'd been stabbed in the gut by her and that she'd nearly bled to death. He also knew that she'd undergone a sort of quirk awakening, not unlike Kaken had before Shigaraki had pierced his heart, causing her zero gravity to ping-pong across the battlefield and render everyone weightless. Despite her impressive display of newfound power, it was only Toga's sacrifice that had kept Uraraka alive at the cost of her own life. Even though he knew that Toga's death had caused immense grief and guilt in Uraraka, he was grateful for her sacrifice. Had she not made that choice, chosen Uraraka over herself, then she would be gone, and that was a future and a path he didn't want to think about. One he refused to acknowledge. It'd be like losing Kaken, but different. "I should have died. But, well, she wanted me to live more than anything else, I guess," Uraraka said in a voice that was edged with an undertone of sadness. Izuku was silent, uncertain what he wanted to say. They'd both done the bulk of their grieving over their respective losses, but grief and loss were tricky things. No one mourned the same way, and no one could really say exactly how long grief was supposed to last, or if it ever really ended and didn't just become something that grew easier to bear with time. Just as suffering and pain are unique to the individual, so too was grief. They'd spoken about their hurts before, and he'd gone so far as to call her his hero, but there was more to say. He just wasn't sure what it was or how to say it. "I'm sorry she died, but I'm so very glad that you're here and that she chose to save you. I wish 𝗵𝗃𝗃 hadn't died, I really do," but his voice trailed off as he struggled to express what he wanted to say. His mind felt slow and unyielding, but at the same time as if it were on the cusp of a realization, and it was slowing down his ability to communicate clearly. "What am I trying to say? What do I want to say to her? What is this feeling that I can't name, that keeps putting butterflies in my stomach? I wish she hadn't died, I wish Shigaraki hadn't died too, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm really glad you're still here and that she chose to save you. His voice trailed off as he continued to struggle. The importance to me was that what he was trying to convey. That she was important to him. Was it just that he wanted to make clear to her that she was his dearest friend and he was massively relieved that she still lived despite being on the threshold of death? No, there felt like there was more to it. More that he needed to say, but he still wasn't sure what that more was, let alone how to say it. Thank you. I'm glad to be here too. I'm sad she's gone and I truly wish I could change things, bring her back somehow, or change how much BLD I'd lost so that she could live, but I can't do that, so I guess I've just got to do the best with the gift she gave me, Uraraka said in a rush, her cheeks taking on a pink hue. I'm glad you didn't have to stay armless though, that would have been horrible. Deku gave a short chuckle as he thought of 𝗵𝘃𝗄. I don't know, 𝗵𝘃𝗄 makes it look pretty cool. The serious and pained expression on Uraraka's face lightened, and she gave a small laugh at his statement. Haha, I think she could make anything look good. She's not wrong about that, but then again, I think Uraraka could make anything look good too, Deku thought to himself with a blush. Eager to shift his train of thought elsewhere, he said, Kaken sees her every now and then in physical therapy. Uraraka raised her eyebrows in surprise. Really? I didn't know that. Aside from the one time we all teamed up, I've not seen them work all that much together, though they seem like they have similar personalities. They're both pretty fiery. Kaken sometimes complains about her when he comes back from PT, though I think secretly he likes seeing her there, Deku explained with a smile. The Ferris wheel had made a few up and over the amusement park to the point that Deku was fairly certain that they must be nearing one of the last. Soon the ride would end and he and Uraraka would have to get off of it, their bubble of shared intimacy broken. He looked at her to see that she was once again looking out the window and down at their surroundings. What did he want to tell her? What did he want to convey? He felt like he was trying to see through a metaphorical fog that existed in his mind as he searched for the answer to that question. Sometimes he felt like he was close to finding it, or that the fog was about to lift, but then the clouds would return or he'd lose sight of what he'd been searching for. The answer was there, it was just hidden somewhere deep in his mind. A stomach growl interrupted Deku's self-reflection. Deku blinked in surprise as he realized that the growl belonged to Uraraka. Oh, she was hungry. Are you hungry? He asked, though he immediately felt stupid for asking such a question, considering it was obvious if the growl in her stomach was anything to go by. Before he could open his mouth to ask what she wanted to eat, Izuku's stomach suddenly growled as well. Guess I'm hungry too. Uraraka looked from the window to him and gave a quiet chuckle. Smiling at him, she said, I guess we're both hungry, huh? Yeah, Deku said with a blush as he glanced out the window briefly to see if he could see any nearby food vendors. What do you think you want to eat? He asked as he looked out the window. He could see what looked like a takoyaki stall and a little further away a ramen vendor. Just as he was starting to turn away from the window, his eye caught a neon sign of a crepe with a neon strawberry on it. They were close to a crepe vendor. That would be a nice little treat to have. That is, until he remembered the associated romantic implications with crepes. I'm not sure. I don't feel super hungry. I guess I'd be good for anything. Uraraka said as she too started looking out the window. If we have a crepe, then we can just have two separate crepes, not shared. Keep it nice and friendly because that's what you are, friends, he thought to himself as he turned from the window. The Ferris wheel had stopped its and was now subject to random starts and stops as the ride attendants let ride-goers out of their booths. Do you think you're more in the mood for sweet or savory? Deku asked in a cheery voice that he hoped didn't reflect his flustered thoughts about shared crepes. Their booth shook as the ride started up briefly and then jangled to a stop. Both Uraraka and Deku wobbled in their respective seats. Maybe sweet. I had a really salty miso soup earlier today that's left me craving something sweet, I think, she answered. Sweet like crepes? Shut up. Oh, well, what about taiyaki or crepe or cupcakes? Deku bumbled, his voice strained as he mentally slapped himself for trying to mention crepes. Get it together. Crepes, she repeated, her head slightly tilted to the side in question. Like shared. Not shared. That is unless you want to. No, she doesn't want to share a crepe with you. Calm down. People who have feelings for each other do that, and she doesn't like you like that, and all she is just your free. His own inner thoughts stopped dead with that thought as the fog that had been clouding his mind suddenly parted like Moses and the Red Sea. She's not just my friend, she's my hero, and she's important to me. She's special. More special than anyone else. When she enters a room, I immediately pay attention. When she speaks, I always listen. Whenever we're in class or in some group setting, my eyes always search for her before I look for anyone else. I think she's the most kind and courageous person I've ever met. I like spending time with her as much if not more than any of my other friends. I think she's pretty, and I've noticed things about her that I've never noticed about another person before. I think about all of my friends, but I think about her more than anyone else. I risked burning up my remaining embers of OFA just to find her and comfort her because I knew she was hurting. I like talking to her, I like listening to her or hearing what she thinks and feels. I love all of my friends and everyone in general, but I think I might love her. Wait, really? I like her. That's it. That's what I've not been able to see until just now. The door to their booth suddenly rattled open and the attendant teenager gave them an impatient sigh before gesturing for them to exit. Deku's inner realization was put on hold as both he and Uraraka rose and began to exit the booth. Outwardly Izuku looked like he always did, but inwardly, he felt like he had a million fires burning all at once at his realization. Just as Uraraka stepped up to the exit and began to move out of the booth, she paused and turned to look at him. Deku was paying only mild attention since half of his attention was entirely focused on the panic within at the realization that he didn't just like Ochako Uraraka as a friend and what that meant. Deku, I didn't say it earlier, but, she started, but another irritated sigh from the attendant interrupted her. Come on kid, get to it. They barked in annoyance, but Uraraka seemed unfazed and continued to look back at him. Deku's attention finally snapped onto her and the irritated-looking late-aged teenager who was acting as the Ferris wheel attendant. He opened his mouth to speak up in her defense but was unable to speak before Uraraka beat him to it. You're important to me too. I'm glad we're both here. She smiled at him before turning away and stepping the rest of the way out of the booth, much to the relief of the impatient attendant. Deku stared after her. I'm important to her, but does that mean that I'm important like a friend or like something else? He mechanically climbed out of the booth to follow after Uraraka, his mind abuzz with a possible deeper meaning in what she just said to him. Not to mention the fact that he still had to figure out how he wanted to react to the fact that he just realized that his feelings for her weren't exactly the friendly type. It was a completely alien experience to him. He'd never liked anyone before. Sure, there'd been childhood crushes, but even those had been few and far between. His whole life he'd been obsessed with heroes and all might and singularly focused on becoming a hero. When he'd received one, for all that focus had become even more central. Heroes and helping people were almost exclusively what he knew. Loving everyone and treating everyone as equals had always been paramount, until this moment. Izuku had always been acutely aware of the opposite 𝗧𝗵𝗲, oftentimes feeling flustered or blushing when presented with things like obvious melons or a girl in his face, but there'd never been anything more to it than that. He was curious about the opposite 𝗧𝗵𝗲, but not in a way that lent itself to romantic or SXL interest. Until now, and even now, he wasn't really sure what these feelings meant in the long run. Did it mean he wanted to go out and do SXL things all of the sudden, or be suave and go on romantic dates where he serenaded Uraraka? No, it just meant that he wanted more than pure friendship with her. He was interested in exploring and pursing what that more would be, and, for the first time in his life, he wanted to share a relationship with another person in a way that wasn't platonic. Deku stepped out of the booth, his eyes wide and locked onto the auburn-haired girl. It didn't matter that they were in a crowded place and that there were others all around them. All he had were eyes for her. He took in her sundress again, the way the wind caught her hair, the delicate curve of her bare neck, and he felt like a blind man seeing color for the first time. I'm in love with her. How did I not know it until just this moment? It's always been there, I just never saw it until now. He stepped closer to her, his heart rate increasing and his palms sweating as he ached to hold her hand. Uraraka turned around to face him, a small smile on her face. Her eyes locked with his, and in that moment, he felt like everything else fell away but her. The smile on her face morphed into curiosity when she saw his face, and a blush began to dot her cheeks, her eyes going wide. Uraraka. Deku inched closer to her, his hand moving of its own accord to reach out for her, unspoken words beginning to take shape on his tongue until a loud shout directed at them froze him in place. "Hey, you two!" A voice shouted in their direction. Both Uraraka and Deku looked in the direction of the voice only to see the crepe vendor that Deku had spotted from up in the Ferris wheel. A cranky-looking middle-aged man was leaning over the counter. He was looking in their direction, his mouth twisted into a frown of impatience. "I have an order for you," he called at them. Deku looked at the crepe vendor in confusion. He wordlessly pointed to himself, and eyebrow raising in question. The vendor rolled his eyes and gave a vigorous nod. Both Deku and Uraraka slowly made their way over to the crepe stall until they stood just in front of it. The man handed out a freshly made crepe that was covered in cream, strawberry, and chocolate sauce. 3 large strawberries stuck out of the cream. "But we didn't order this," Deku stated in confusion. "A crepe? Obviously. Someone else did for you. Rude Bunch told me what to look for and who to give it to and paid me and left. So take it," the cantankerous man said and again offered the crepe. "But who would just order us a crepe?" Uraraka questioned. "Told ya, bunch of rude kids. You kids these days. Idiots the lot of you. Take your crepe and go find a tree to embrace under." "But," the man said and turned away from them. Deku slowly reached out and grabbed the large crepe, his eyes on the sweet treat, his stomach growling in annoyance at his slowness to accept the food, his mouth watering in anticipation. But it was just one crepe which meant they'd have to share it. He looked up at Uraraka, who was eyeing the crepe suspiciously. Deku cast a curious glance around them to see if there were any familiar faces amongst the crowd, but no one stood out. "I thought this all seemed like kind of a setup. I wonder if the others are here, and if they did this. Are you okay sharing? Or well, we could just get another one if you want," Uraraka asked, her voice timid and uncertain. Izuku looked from the crowd to the girl next to him and felt butterflies fill his stomach, except this time, he understood why they were there in the first place. He was excited to be there with her, to be alone with her, to be alone with a girl he liked as more than just a friend. Quietly, nervously, he said, "I am if you are." Bakugo watched, a smirk on his face, as Todoroki took a shaky sip of water. Endeavor's shining star was still green at the gills, his sickly pallor refusing to let up even after throwing up multiple times. The half-hot half-cold quirked boy had been queasy since Bakugo had taken him on the teacups and used the dial in the center to send them in an unreasonable number of circles. Far more than any of the other ride-goers spun their teacups. It had been Katsuki's intention to upset what he knew was a delicate tummy. Todoroki might have been a powerhouse in terms of his quirk, but Bakugo could sniff out a weak stomach from a mile away, and Todoroki reeked of one. Thanks to his rigid upbringing, a fragile constitution in terms of thrill ride tolerance was almost a guarantee. What Bakugo hadn't thought of was the fact that his sort of friend wouldn't just bounce back after barfing. No, he was still super pale and sweaty and liable to blow chunks again at any moment. Because he hadn't foreseen that possibility, he was now rather limited in the rides he could ride or even the amount of teasing and cajoling he'd normally enjoy. Todoroki looked like a sick puppy, and it just wasn't as fun to poke fun at or force a frail constitution onto thrill rides if they were already sick. "You think you're gonna live icy hot?" Bakugo asked, his tone caught between annoyed and amused. Underneath that bluster though, he was a little concerned for his classmate. "I'll be fine, I just need to lie down, I think. We should probably end this outing, seeing as I'm in no shape to ride rides or do, well, you're an Azui's version of light stalking," Todoroki answered in a shaky voice. Bakugo could see sweat on his upper lip and wondered how close he was to throwing up again. "No SHT, you're in no condition to ride rides and we aren't doing light stalking. It's assisting 2 idiots who can't acknowledge the elephant in the room," Bakugo snapped in response. Todoroki looked over to him with a doubtful expression. The two were seated on a bench that overlooked a Ferris wheel with a crepe stall not far away from it. Azui had been over at the crepe vendor the entire time, seemingly having some sort of conversation with the seller. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 had briefly wondered if her plan was more involved than simply buying a carefully timed crepe before focusing on 𝗳𝗪𝗢𝗀𝗀𝗃 and the fact that he continued to look more and more like a sickly corpse. You're referring to the attraction between the two. I don't see how it's any of our business. If they have some underlying attraction to each other, that's their business, not ours. This all feels like interfering to me, 𝗳𝗪𝗢𝗀𝗃 said as he brushed a hand over his face to wipe away some of the sweat. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 gave an annoyed sigh. Of course someone like Shoto 𝗳𝗪𝗢𝗃 would be adamantly opposed to trying to encourage two morons to acknowledge their feelings for each other. Not that Katsuki thought staging a theme park date for the two was the best option, but he did agree with Azui in that the two were beating around the bush and probably needed a little bit of outside help. It was ironic since 𝗳𝗪𝗢𝗃 was basically the picture of emotional constipation and had required strong interference from the nerd before he could even acknowledge some of his own deeper feelings. Yeah, you would think that even though Deku basically had to beat it into your head that you're independent of endeavor and your future is your own. That wasn't his business, but he did it, and look at you now. Nothing like your old man and carving your own path. You even smile on occasion. Don't get me wrong, you still look like a robot trying to smile, but hey, it's a start, Katsuki smirked. Frowning, 𝗳𝗪𝗢𝗃𝗲 said, "Gee, thanks." He turned away from 𝗵𝗃𝗲 to look toward Azui, who was still chatting up the crepe vendor. I think if she gets any kind of food that it'll make me sick again. I'm barely able to keep the water I drank down. I think I'm going to leave. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 snorted. Suit yourself. I can kick it with the toad. Think this is her last intervention attempt anyway, so, see ya. I still don't think you should be setting them up like this, 𝗳𝗪𝗢𝗃𝗲 said as he stood up, his stance visibly wobbly. Well, if someone doesn't step in, then those two idiots will keep dancing around the obvious until they're old and irrelevant, and I don't know about you, but I can't stand the idea of listening to the nerd lament unrequited love for years to come. He's so moody about that shithead Shigaraki dying already, and he didn't even like that wacko. Imagine if his chance with round face slipped through his fingers entirely. He already thinks so poorly of himself that he's oblivious to the affections of others and has resigned himself that this is all there is. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 paused to point a finger around them. One day though, he's going to realize that there was more, and he's gonna 𝗬𝗪𝗀𝗃𝗃 himself when he realizes that he missed that and be insufferable. 𝗳𝗪𝗢𝗃𝗃 was silent for a moment as he considered what 𝗵𝗃𝗲 had said. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 watched as unidentifiable emotions briefly played out on the taller boy's face. I agree with some of what you said, but I still don't think setting them up this way is the right way to go about it. There is almost certainly a better and less manipulative way to achieve the same goal. Katsuki rolled his eyes. Thought you were leaving, icy hot. Hit the road before you yak again. Azui might come back at any moment with some hot smelly crepe in hand. At 𝗵𝗃𝗲's words, 𝗳𝗪𝗢𝗃𝗃's face took on an even darker shade of green, making him give a curt nod. You're right. See you. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 watched with a smirk on his face as his friend walked away from him and merged into the crowd of park goers. Hopefully he didn't have to throw up between here and UA. A train ride back would probably make him barf for sure. Then again, he could probably just call up some of Endeavor's lackeys and get them to drive him back to UA. What did it matter to him, anyway? His gaze drifted from the exiting 𝗳𝗪𝗢𝗃𝗃 and toward Azui, who looked like she was still chatting up the crepe seller. What the F is she still talking to that old geezer about? She's been over there since the second we spotted the nerd and Cheeks get on the Ferris wheel. That shitty but ride is gonna end soon, and we better skedaddle before that. Maybe she's flirting with the old F. That's F stupid. Why the F would she flirt with an old bstrd like that? Why the F do I care? I don't care who she flirts with, or do I? No, I don't. Katsuki sighed in irritation, annoyed by his inner thoughts and how prickly it made him feel to see her talking to some random street vendor. He rose from the bench and made his way over to her side, eager to see what they were talking about while also eager to get them to enact whatever her final plan was so that he could actually enjoy the amusement park. You kids from UA sure are amazing. I sheltered at UA and I was just so impressed by all of you. Crazy to think you're all just kids. The street vendor gushed. Thank you. We were just doing our best to protect everyone. I'm glad that things are back to normal now, Azui said in response. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 moved up next to her, intentionally bumping shoulders with her, making her look back at him in surprise. Her eyes widened slightly at his appearance by her side. Why the F is it so surprising? That I'm here. I was in on this whole stupid harebrained dipshit plan from the beginning, he thought to himself petulantly as he eyed the middle-aged seller. He was balding, his skin marred with sunspots from having too much time in the sun unprotected. He had boring brown eyes and what looked like a sad little cookie duster mustache. Pathetic old pervert, hitting on a high school girl. Yo, frog face, we gotta bounce soon or else the nerd and round face are gonna discover us. Pinch it off, we. He said as he side-eyed 𝗬𝗎𝗎𝗎. Oh, I know you. You were one of the UA students that fought all for one. I saw a lot of your fight on TV, so impressive. You're amazingly talented. The man was looking at Katsuki now, his face excited and emanating genuine awe. Flattery will get you nowhere, he thought to himself with an internal growl. Whatever, old man, just take our order and quit hitting on underage girls. 2 strawberry and cream crepes and load them with chocolate and strawberry drizzle. He snapped as he moved his hand into his pocket and pulled out a few hundred yen and moved it at the seller, who blinked in shock at Katsuki's rudeness. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 then pulled out his phone and quickly flipped through some of his photos before he found a selfie that Deku had taken of them and later sent to Katsuki. Katsuki was flipping off the camera and glaring while Deku was smiling brightly. He pinched and zoomed on the shot of Deku and turned it round so the seller could see it. See this idiot here. Green hair. Freckles. Except now he's got a gnarly scar on his cheek that you can't miss. The crepe is for him. He paused again to look over to 𝗬𝗎𝗎𝗎, yo Toady, show him a pic of cheeks so that he can recognize her too. Ribbit, good idea, 𝗬𝗎𝗎𝗎 said with a nod as she too pulled out her phone and started sorting through photos until she found one that she deemed acceptable. She turned her phone around so that the seller could see the picture. But 𝗵𝗃𝗲𝗎, I need it to only be one crepe. It is just one crepe, stupid. The other one is for us. Come on. 𝗬𝗎𝗎𝗎 stared at him in surprise. What? But, you want to share? Katsuki rolled his eyes and ignored her question, his gaze redirecting back to the still shocked crepe vendor. You get all that, baldy. 2 crepes, one will take and one for these 2 idiots we just showed you pictures of. At 𝗵𝗃𝗲𝗎's crass words, the spell of shock finally seemed to wear off over the seller. Excuse me. That was extremely rude. Do you talk to your mother with such a rude and disrespectful tone? 𝗵𝗃𝗲𝗎 couldn't stop the laugh that erupted from his lips at the vendor's rhetorical question. Ha! I talk far worse to that old hag. The vendor's mouth fell open in shock at the blonde's words. Sorry about him, he's kind of rude, ribbit. I apologize for his behavior. Do you think you can give one of the crepes to the people we showed you pictures of? They should be getting off the Ferris wheel shortly, 𝗬𝗎𝗎𝗎𝗎 said in a rush, her tone apologetic. The vendor turned his gaze from 𝗵𝗃𝗲𝗎 and back to 𝗬𝗎𝗎𝗎𝗎, his expression softening just a little. For you, yes, but my dear girl, you should really reconsider who you spend your time with. Reconsider who she spends her time with. What the F? As if who she spends time with is any of this bald, old, fat F's business. A stab of anger ripped through 𝗵𝗃𝗲𝗎's mind. Who the F was this old but pervert to make such suggestions to a random teenage girl? What a pages. She can spend whatever time she wants with whoever she wants. Now hand over the crepe, you creep, Katsuki hissed. So rude. The vendor frowned before begrudgingly turning away to pull out an already prepared crepe from further back in the stall. I certainly hope these children you've shown me pictures of aren't as rude as you are. The middle-aged man drizzled chocolate and strawberry sauce over it before putting the crepe in a protective sleeve before it out toward 𝗵𝗃𝗲𝗎𝗎 and glaring at him. Now, please leave my stall. Already gone, baldy. 𝗵𝗃𝗲𝗎 snorted and turned away from the crepe stall, one hand holding the crepe, the other tugging on 𝗬𝗎𝗎𝗎𝗎's wrist. Sorry again. 𝗬𝗎𝗎𝗎𝗎 yelled back toward the crepe vendor as Katsuki continued pulling her away. 𝗵𝗃𝗲𝗎, that was really rude. Katsuki rolled his eyes and took a bite of the crepe. It wasn't particularly warm or fresh tasting, making him wonder if that shady pervert vendor had just grabbed some strawberry crepe made from hours ago. F lazy b. He thought to himself as he a bit of drizzle from his lip. Move it, frog face, or the nerd and cheeks are gonna spot us. We gotta make tracks, he said as he moved them into and through the crowd. He heard 𝗬𝗎𝗄𝗧 groan in annoyance and half expected her to rip her arm free of him but was surprised when she made no move to pull free. "We need to stay close enough to make sure they get the crepe," 𝗬𝗎𝗄𝗧 pointed out. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 gave a tiny head nod of acknowledgement before stopping at the entry to another ride that was within eyeshot of both the Ferris wheel and the crepe shop. "Good enough for you?" He grunted and handed the crepe over to her. 𝗬𝗎𝗄𝗧 looked at the offered dessert with a puzzled expression before gingerly taking it. "Rip, yes, this will do." She was silent for a moment as her gaze moved from the crepe and toward the Ferris wheel. The attendant for the Ferris wheel had stopped the ride and appeared to be letting people off of it now. Good, that means the nerd and Cheeks should be off soon and get their crepe. Not that that will be enough for them stop being pussies and confess. "Are you sure you want to share?" 𝗬𝗎𝗄𝗧 asked, interrupting Katsuki's thoughts. He looked at her in confusion. Did she really think he was such a greedy pig that he wanted the entire crepe to himself? He wasn't even that big a fan of desserts in general, so why would he want to pig out on one? Or was it she was surprised that he was willing to share because he'd already had a bite and that counted as an indirect embrace or whatever? Katsuki had to refrain from snorting in amusement at such a notion. As if that would bother him. Number 1, who cared if something like sharing a drink or food was sort of in a lazy roundabout way an indirect embrace? And number 2, she'd literally sat on his face half a dozen times and vice versa over the last few months. They'd already multiple times, sure those weren't exactly passionate or lovey-dovey, but they'd clearly already swapped spit and then some and were already well acquainted with each other's cooties. "You literally sat on my face earlier this week, not to mention all the times you've given me like insane blow Joe." He started but was suddenly slapped on his good shoulder. "Hey!" He snapped and looked over at her in annoyance. He was surprised to see the bright red color in her cheeks and the embarrassment in her eyes. She was embarrassed or uncomfortable talking so openly about that, he thought to himself as he took in his surroundings and the fact that they were around many other people. Not that it really looked like anyone was looking at them or listening to them, but still, it made sense that she might feel uncomfortable about such personal details being openly shared. Sorry," he said in a gravelly and quiet voice. Apologizing was so uncomfortable. "My point was that we've already, so I don't really see what the big deal is with sharing a crepe, but if sharing it it makes you uncomfortable or whatever, I'll take it back and we can just go buy you one of your own." 𝗬𝗎𝗄𝗧's gaze shifted away from him and she shook her head. "No, it's okay, I just didn't want you to talk so openly about stuff we've done and 𝗵𝗃𝗍, I was a little surprised by you being okay with sharing it. That's just, well, it's just a kind of thing that couples do." "Couples? Does she want that?" He wondered to himself and opened his mouth to speak before a mop of messy green hair exiting the Ferris wheel caught his eye. Ah, the nerd is exiting the ride with Cheeks in tow. They're off the ride. Old effer better give him their crepe. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 snapped as his gaze moved from Deku and Uraraka and back toward the crepe vendor. Katsuki watched as Deku seemed to hesitate once he was off the ride, facing Uraraka. Uraraka was looking at him too, but because they were facing each other it made it impossible for Katsuki to see what their expressions were. He thought he saw Izuku's hand start to move forward and toward the brunette until it stopped dead when the crepe vendor shouted out to them. Both Deku and Uraraka turned in the direction of the crepe vendor. Well, 𝗵𝘃𝗲 blocked by the old man, though at least he is going to give them their crepe, he thought to himself as he watched a clearly confused Deku move toward the crepe stall. Not that what he'd just seen was an actual confession, but it had looked serious. Maybe this stupid plan was going to work after all. Beside him, 𝗬𝗎𝗄𝗧 gave a long sigh before turning toward Katsuki. "Ribbit, that was the last part of my plan. We could continue to watch, but, 𝗵𝗃𝗍, that feels inappropriate at this point. We've done what we could to set them up for a romantic amusement park date. Do you want to leave or ride more rides?" 𝗵𝘃𝗲 looked at her and snorted. "I want to ride more rides. Part of the reason I agreed to this was because it meant that I could ride all the rides, so now that it's up to the nerd and round face to get the sand out of there, let's hop to it." He turned to leave but felt a gentle tug on his shirt that made him stop and look back to see that 𝗬𝗎𝗄𝗧 was tugging on him. "Where'd Todoroki go? Is he in the bathroom throwing up again?" she asked, her gaze moving around them searching for their friend. "He went home. Icy Hot was certain to spew again if he stayed, 𝗵𝘃𝗲 said with a smirk. Well, I think he would have had an easier and nicer time if you hadn't spun the teacups like a psychopath, 𝗵𝗃𝗲, she retorted. Not my fault he's got a delicate constitution, 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗲 quipped back. 𝗵𝗃𝗲. I don't think that's really very fair, she said before pausing to look back toward Deku and Uraraka. The two were facing each other now, a large crepe held in Deku's hands, an expression of uncertainty on his face. Do you still want to ride rides if it's just with me? Why the hell wouldn't I? He asked, genuinely perplexed by her question. Wasn't it obvious that he liked her to some extent? He liked her well enough to engage in SXL activity with her on multiple occasions, well enough that he'd agreed to carry out her plan with her and had only involved Todoroki so as not to raise too much suspicion from Deku, well enough that he could carry conversations with her. Wasn't that obvious? Well, because that's sort of a couple thing, or well, I guess it's a friend thing too. 𝗵𝗃𝗲. I don't know. Doesn't it make you feel self-conscious? She asked, an edge of insecurity in her voice. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 gave a snort. Couple thing or friend thing, who cares? Let's go and ride some rides, frog face. He again attempted to move forward, this time grabbing her wrist again and pulling her with him, but she resisted, making him stop. What? He snapped in irritation at her hesitation. Are we a couple? She asked, uncertainty clear in her face. Are we? I don't know and I don't really care. We spend time together and on occasion and it's a lot of fun, and today we're at an amusement park together. Does that mean we're a couple? I don't know. Not even sure what a couple does since I have zero interest in romantic SHT. If she wants to be a couple, that's fine, or if she wants to be friends with benefits, that's fine too. See where SHT leads us, or until we get bored or whatever. I don't know. Do you want to be? I don't do romantic SHT and have zero interest in lovey-dovey SHT. I like what we do now, but if you want to hold hands and HT, I guess we could do that on occasion, but it's not really my style. If you want to call us a couple, that's fine with me, and if you want to call us friends with benefits, that's fine too. You're not the worst to hang with, so I don't care either way. So, can we go ride rides now? 𝗵𝘃𝗲 asked. Hopefully that explained enough of what his thoughts were on what they were for her. Azuie looked at him, surprise evident on her face. 𝗵𝗃𝗲. Never expected you to say that. Oh, F off, now are you coming or not? He asked with an eye roll. She gave him an impish smile before stepping forward to be closer to him. Let's go. About time. Ochako stared at the large crepe in Deku's hands, her mind moving a mile a minute. Someone had made sure to pay for and order a singular crepe just for them. There was no way that was coincidence. I wonder if 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had something to do with this, but that just seems so invasive for her. What is she trying to pull? Was 𝗵𝘃𝗲 in on it? What are they trying to make happen between Deku and I? Are they trying to set us up together? If you are. Deku's words interrupted her thoughts and she looked at him in surprise. He's okay with it. But sharing means an indirect embrace. She heard herself say as she felt her cheeks start to burn with embarrassment. The sound of Deku's stomach growling gratefully acted as a temporary distractor to her teenage awkwardness. You should have the fist bite. Deku's eyes lowered from Ochako's face and to the crepe, his cheeks darkening to scarlet. Right? She watched as he gave a little lick to the cream that was drizzled with a healthy amount of both strawberry and chocolate sauce. Somehow the innocent dart of his tongue over the dessert made her stomach flip-flop and avert her eyes. It was just away some of the drizzle and cream. There was nothing dirty or SXL about that. Why did it make her cheeks and neck burn with embarrassment? Deku took a large bite of the crepe, cream coating his nose and upper lip. He let out a brief giggle as more of the drizzle and cream coated one of his cheeks. He'd taken just one bite and yet somehow had managed to get half of it all over his face. Watching Deku make a mess of himself made the flustered feelings start to subside and she felt herself relax a little. She even began to wonder if Deku had been a messy eater as a baby and toddler. Deku took another bite and managed to get even more sauce on his already messy face. Ochako couldn't help but laugh a little at the sight. You're making quite a mess, she giggled as she recalled that she had a handkerchief in her purse. Here, she said as she opened her purse and began rifling through it until she found the pink hanky. There was a tiny package of wet wipes in her purse too, which she also pulled out. I guess I forgot how messy eating a crepe can be, Deku said with a bashful smile. Here, use the wet wipes, Uraraka instructed and held the little package out to him. Are you sure? I'd hate to waste your nice wet wipes just because I was being messy, Deku clarified, his hand hovering halfway between taking the offered wipes and falling to his side. I'm sure, she said with a head nod and watched as he at last took the wipes from her. Thank you, he said as he opened the little package and began to try to wipe off some of the cream and sauce. He ended up needing to use almost all of the wipes since the package was small, with the wipes being only about the size of a small sheet of origami paper, and the mess he'd made on his face was rather extensive. Once he'd finished cleaning off his face, without thinking, 𝗬𝗧𝗄 stepped forward with her pink hanky and gave a quick wipe over his cheeks and lips. She was midway wiping the little hanky over his lips when she realized what she was doing, felt a blush start to color her cheeks and practically bounced away from him. Sorry, didn't think, she said, clearly embarrassed. Oh no, it's okay, I sort of used up most of the wet wipes, sorry, Deku apologized. Honestly, 𝗬𝗧𝗄 didn't care that he'd used most of her wet wipes. She was more concerned with the fact that she'd stepped into his personal space and gone about wiping his face off like some sort of overbearing mother hen. She still held the hanky she'd used on him in her hand and looked at it in mortification. Did he think she was a complete weirdo now? Desperate to change the direction of her thoughts, she said, Don't worry about the wipes. I got them at the 100 yen store, so they were really cheap. What do I do with my hanky? Do I just put it back in my purse? I think I'd like to do that, but won't that seem weird or too forward or gross even? What do I do with it? Do you want some of the crepe? Deku asked in an uncertain voice. The crepe. Take a big ol bite of the crepe to change the subject. She thought to herself desperately, completely forgetting the fact that it would most definitely count as an indirect embrace. Yes, I'll have a bite. Holding the mostly used up wet wipes with one hand, the other holding the crepe, Deku held the dessert out to her. 𝗬𝗧𝗄 was flustered enough that she missed the slight tremor that was visible while he held the crepe out to her. She quickly took it from him and eagerly took a quick but small bite, the sweetness of strawberries mixed with chocolate sauce, cream, and fried pastry tickling her tongue. It actually tasted pretty good. The pleasant flavor surprised her enough that she momentarily forgot about anything else. Oh wow, this is actually pretty good, she exclaimed as she took another slightly bigger bite of the crepe. Unlike Deku, she managed to keep her face mostly clean and only got a little dash of cream on the tip of her nose. 𝗬𝗧𝗄 used her finger to brush away the cream on her nose as she went in for another bite, her gaze moving up to Deku's face and seeing the blush in his cheeks and being momentarily confused by it until she remembered that he'd eaten a portion of the crepe just minutes before. That's right. He took the first few bites. I was so distracted by stepping into his personal space and using my hanky on him that I completely forgot that this totally counts as an indirect embrace. An indirect embrace. How did I forget that? No wonder he is blushing. We just sort of oh no. Her mouth was frozen on the edge of the crepe where she now bit down strong, to the point of accidentally biting her tongue before it back toward Deku. What's he thinking? Oh my gosh. What is he thinking? Here, you can have the rest, I've eaten quite a bit of it. Uraraka's eyes were downcast, her cheeks hot with embarrassment. Deku slowly reached back out and took the offered crepe from her. I thought it was pretty good too. I'm glad if you like it. His voice was soft and velvety and made those deeply buried feelings rise up closer to the surface. You have the most wonderful voice. I like listening to you talk. I like spending time with you. Anytime I talk to you, I feel better about most everything. You're so sweet and kind and brave. Himiko was right to like you, and she didn't even know you like I know you. I wish I could be so brave as she was and proclaim my love for you. No. Absolutely not. Things are fine the way they are. We are just friends, and these feelings, these big feelings don't belong here with me. They need to stay buried. Dig deep, 𝗬𝗧𝗄, and push them down. Things are fine the way they are. I don't need more. This is enough. That same alien voice needled her from within, and she felt a wave of panic begin to wash over her. Those feelings that she'd so carefully protected and withheld from everyone aside from Tsu and Himiko Toga were threatening to erupt in spectacular fashion. Now was not the time, and it'd probably never be the time because she didn't want to rock the boat and she was unwilling to jeopardize their friendship, and there were far more important things out there than romance. She had to focus on her future, on being a hero and helping the 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 of the world. That was most important. A life lived without romance was just as fulfilling as one with it, even if said romance was stifled. That's a lie. This time, she wasn't sure if the voice was alien or her own, but regardless, it was not a helpful thought. Speak, move, or say something. Yeah, it's pretty tasty. I guess the cranky guy makes a pretty good crepe, she said with a forced laugh, her expression on the ground, unwilling to look at Deku's face for fear that seeing whatever was there would compel her to speak words she was terrified of speaking. There was a silence between them that felt agonizing to Uraraka until Deku broke it. Hey Uraraka, so, I was trying to say something to you when we got off the Ferris wheel, before the crepe seller called out to us. His voice was velvety soft and made Uraraka feel like she was hearing the melodic long strings of a harp. She risked looking up from the ground to his face and instantly regretted it. His eyes were large, like deep pools of water with unfathomable depths. His expression serious and yet incredibly tender. It was an expression that locked her in place and made butterflies dance about wildly in the pit of her stomach. He still held the crepe with one hand, the other the used-up wet wipes. Ochako watched wide-eyed as he took a micro-step closer to her. What did you want to say? Her voice was nothing more than a squeak. Pink colored his cheeks and uncertainty flashed in his eyes, but they never left her face. Well, I was thinking when we were up in the Ferris wheel, and I know I said you were important to me and I meant that, but there was more to it than that. His voice trailed off and he scratched nervously at the back of his neck with the hand that held the used wet wipes. There was more to it than that. The words echoed in her head and made her heart start to race and her palms begin to sweat. Her carefully concealed thoughts and feelings began to roil within her and claw at her from the inside, demanding to finally be heard. No, I can't let it change, Before he could finish whatever it was that he was trying to say, Ochako said in a panicky rush, hold that thought, I've got to go to the bathroom. She didn't wait for him to respond and instead turned on her heel and rushed away from him and in a random direction until she saw a sign for the restroom. Ochako hastily moved in that direction, vaguely aware that Deku was following after her. The bathroom was in sight and she practically ran into it. She stopped just inside the restroom where she tried to take a few calming breaths but found that wasn't all that helpful. Ochako moved over to the bank of sinks and stood there and looked at her reflection. She looked like she always did, though this time with a bit redder cheeks and eyes that were a little wide with surprise or perhaps fear. Lowering her gaze to the sink, she turned on the water and cupped her hands under the running tap. She splashed the cupped water over her face and let out a deep breath as she leaned over the sink, her hands now resting on either side of it. Whatever he has to say isn't necessarily something like he likes me. It could be that, but it might not be that too. If I can just be in here for a minute and gather my thoughts and put my feelings back where they belong, then I'll be okay, she thought to herself as she turned the tap off. But if he's going to tell me something like that, then I'm not sure it'll be okay. I'm not sure that I can keep my own feelings to myself then. What's wrong with that? Uraraka barely even gave that alien inner voice more than a second thought now. It seemed to be persistent when it came to Deku and her deeply hidden feelings for him. Perhaps it was the embodiment of her repressed emotions. She'd heard about repressed thoughts and feelings manifesting in different ways. Maybe this was that. Her mind drifted to that day and to 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 confessing that she liked Deku. She thought of the shy blush in the blonde's cheeks and the joyous smile she'd had on her face. She thought of her own words to 𝗵𝗃𝗃 on that same day and how that smile had made her jealous, all true and still true. 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 had had something that Ochako Uraraka didn't, a fearless nature that allowed her to profess her feelings regardless of situation or the potential backlash that such a confession might result in. She'd been brave. Uraraka had no doubt of her own bravery, but it was a different type of bravery than what she'd seen in 𝗵𝗃𝗃 that day. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 had boldly confessed that she'd liked Deku, and it had stunned Uraraka at the time and had largely been the inspiration for her desperate attempt to get 𝗵𝗃𝗃 to talk to her about romance and boys. It had been what had driven her to confess her own feelings for Deku to the emotional blonde. Regardless of 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 being a villain or not, Ochako had been impressed by and jealous of that free spirit that she possessed. That same free spirit and bold affection was ultimately what had led her to sacrifice her own life for Ochako. 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 did what she wanted, liked whoever she liked regardless of who or what they were. She loved freely and completely, without care. It was something that Ochako wanted but felt paralyzed by duty and uncertainty. Wasn't wanting to have a romantic relationship with Deku selfish and distracting to both of their futures as heroes. What would 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 do? She thought to herself before letting out a sad little chuckle. She knew very well what 𝗵𝗃𝗃 would do. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 would act on her feelings and confess exactly what she was feeling and what she wanted. Ochako closed her eyes and again tried to take some calming breaths. She thought of 𝗵𝗃𝗃's face that day, her tears mixed with joy and her perfect smile. She thought of Deku's face, bright with happiness and joy, unclouded by regret and sorrow. The lights flickered overhead and for just a moment Ochako briefly felt the ghostly whisper of arms around her shoulders as if to offer her comfort along with the sensation of someone's head resting against her own. It was an oddly comforting sensation but odd enough that it made Ochako open her eyes and look into the mirror. The lights flickered again and for a split second Uraraka swore she could see 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 standing behind her, her arms resting over Ochako's shoulders, her head leaning against hers and a gentle but encouraging smile on her face. 𝗵𝗃𝗃! Uraraka exclaimed in alarm as she stumbled backwards from the mirror. She half expected to run into someone since she'd clearly seen what could only have been 𝗵𝗃𝗃 behind her, but there was nothing and when she looked back to the mirror, there was only her own reflection. Had she really imagined it? Was she going crazy? She took a step toward the sink and mirror again and looked closely into it. Nothing was out of the ordinary and even though she was certain she'd just seen 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃, there was no 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 there. 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃 was gone and always would be, so why was she thinking about and seeing her now? If she wasn't crazy, then why see some ghostly apparition of her? Why would her mind conjure her? Because I'm not living my truth, I'm only living a part of my truth and ignoring what might be one of the bigger parts of my life. 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 died, sacrificed herself so that I could live. She lived her truth, the way she wanted right up until the end. Maybe, just maybe, I'm thinking of her and saw her and keep hearing this strange voice from inside myself because in some small way that is 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃, or what's left of her, and she's reminding me that she made her sacrifice so that I could live and what I'm doing now, well, it's not fully living. She wanted me to live and be happy and by pretending that my feelings for Deku don't exist, I'm denying an integral part of myself. Uraraka let out a deep breath and stepped away from the mirror, turning toward the bathroom exit. She took a tentative step forward toward the exit, uncertainty touching her heart but a growing confidence and determination blossoming from within. She was not 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 and she never would be and there were just parts of her that would always be chained by caution, hesitation, and duty. She could never fully emulate the carefree, throwing caution to the wind spirit that 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 embodied, but that was okay. Ochako could try to do honor to 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃's memory and her sacrifice by living as her true, authentic self, by embracing and admitting to feelings she'd locked away and had intended to keep locked away forever. I doubt I'll have such a appealing smile like you did, but I'm going to do it 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃. I'm going to tell him how I feel. That might be what he's about to do too, or it might not be, but that doesn't matter. I'm still going to do it because I know it's what you do and if you were here, it's exactly what you'd tell me to do. I'm scared and I don't want to jeopardize the relationship I have with him because I cherish it, but admitting to myself and to him that I want more out of it is okay. I'll never know if there could be more between us if I don't take this risk, if I don't act. Ochako walked out of the bathroom, the natural light of the sun momentarily blinding her. After taking a few seconds for her eyes to adjust, Uraraka looked around, her eyes searching for Deku. She found him standing just a few feet outside the bathroom, his gaze on the crowd and his brow etched with something akin to concern. She began moving toward him. Her movement must have caught his eye because he almost immediately looked in her direction, his face lighting up at seeing her. Uraraka. I was worried. Are you okay? You ran away so quick I thought you'd gotten sick. He moved from where he'd been standing to right up in front of her so that he was only about an arm's length away from her. 𝗬𝗧𝗃 noted that he still held the crepe with one hand but had apparently found some sort of rubbish bin to discard the used wet wipes in. Yeah, sorry about that. I got really nervous about what you might be saying to me, so I just needed to splash some water on my face and think, she explained in a voice that sounded nervous even to her own ears. It's okay if you're nervous, you're about to confess feelings. You've kept locked away for a long time, she reassured herself. Oh, Deku said, his tone turning from concerned to deflated. But it's okay because I'm not nervous about it anymore. Well, that's not totally true. I'm still nervous but for sort of different reasons now, 𝗬𝗧𝗃 said nervously. She looked away from his face for a second before looking back to him, determined to express her feelings and not look away. There was a steadily growing heat in her cheeks that she knew was unavoidable. He questioned, his face confused. I'm in love with you. I have been for a long time, in fact. I just never thought that those feelings had a place in our lives, until now. I was prepared to just carry those feelings myself and keep them buried. We've both chosen paths that are really strong and require a lot of focus, drive, and dedication, and to push our friendship into something romantic just felt sort of selfish and irresponsible, so I never brought it up or did much to acknowledge the feelings I have, but they're still here. After everything, they're always here with me, just waiting for me to act on them, to live my truth. She paused briefly, her anxiety getting the best of her as her eyes flickered away from him. So, I'd like to be more than friends, if that's okay with you. Deku's face had been confused before she'd started speaking, but once she'd confessed what she was actually feeling, his face had gone blank and a healthy red had taken up residence in his cheeks. 𝗬𝗧𝗃 wasn't sure what she'd expected to see there and was partially relieved that he'd looked at her blankly but also concerned by that expression. At least it hadn't been horror, right? That was good, wasn't it? Deku? She questioned nervously. Deku blinked at her and shook his head briefly before giving a nervous chuckle along with a bashful smile. I was actually trying to tell you earlier that I have feelings for you too. I think I've always known that deep down, but I just wasn't really aware of it until now. Romance and relationships have always been something I've been curious about, but not something that I spent a lot of time trying to find. I love everybody and every person is special and unique and worthy of affection, but my feelings for you are a little different than that. They're different from what I feel for Kaken or Todoroki or even All Might. They're unlike anything I've felt or known before. They're special. He stopped for a moment to take a step closer to her so that they were less than an arm's length apart now. So yes, I'd like to be more than friends too. Joy and surprise shot through 𝗬𝗃𝗃's belly and she couldn't help but smile broadly at him. She took in the blush in his cheeks and the nervous but full-faced grin on his face and felt like in that moment her heart might take flight and begin to soar. You like me too? She repeated in a high-pitched and excited voice, unable to contain the enthusiasm that was bubbling out of her in buckets. Yeah, I don't know what that means or what we're supposed to do, but yeah, I do, and it makes me very happy that you have feelings for me too. I wasn't sure. I honestly didn't think that you did, but I'm so glad you do. I'm so happy, 𝗬𝗧𝗃 said in soft voice as she stared at the boy that had captured her affection for the majority of their high school career. What do we do now? Deku asked, his eyes on her, excitement and happiness practically spilling outward. Uraraka gave a little laugh and shook her head. I don't know. Do you want to share more of the crepe and hold hands and go on some rides as a couple? The smile on Deku's face only widened. Yes, I'd like that a lot. Okay, 𝗬𝗧𝗃 said with a nod and a grin, and then carefully moved her hand toward his free hand where she very gently took it in hers. The burning heat in her cheeks grew at the contact, and the already very red blush on Deku's cheeks grew even darker. I've never really held a boy's hand before, well, not like this, she admitted shyly. Me either, Deku seconded. He looked down at their joined hands and smiled again. Much to her surprise, he brought their joined hands up toward his face where he placed a tender embrace over her fingertips. The action made 𝗬𝗃𝗃 blush even more deeply but made her heart and soul sing with joy. It filled her with such elation that she boldly moved forward and planted a brief but affectionate embrace on his cheek. As she moved away from him, she thought that if his cheeks got any redder that his head might explode. She hoped that wasn't the case. Wow. Thanks, he said in tone that was heavy with excitement and surprise. What do you want to ride? She asked, unable to control the excited tilt in her voice. I don't know if we could ride the Ferris wheel again, but you know, as a couple and like sitting side by side and holding hands, he suggested shyly. He's so cute I think I might die, Ochako thought to herself with a smile. That sounds like a great idea. She agreed. The two headed back toward the Ferris wheel, occasionally taking bites of their shared crepe, hands still entwined. At the end of the day, life-ending battles and future heroes aside, they were just two kids that had quietly liked each other for a long time. And now they were able to finally confess those feelings and admit that they wanted to be more than just friends. The end this story is also posted on Wattpad and Fanfiction and has cover art with it that I was granted usage of by the amazing artist 𝗬𝗙𝙢𝙢𝗢𝗍. I'll attach their Patreon and Twitter accounts should you want to take a look at their work. Twitter https://x.com/𝗬𝗙𝗢𝗍𝗬𝗙𝗢𝗍𝗬𝗙𝗎𝗍. Lang equals N Patreon. https://www. Patreon.com/c/𝗬𝗙𝗢𝗢𝗍𝗬𝗎𝗍𝗏 posts.